Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another broadcast from People for Liberty. This is our Juneteenth broadcast. Juneteenth, a lot of people know, became a federal holiday yesterday, the first observance of it. But it's been a holiday that's been around for a long time and means a lot to people who grew up with it. But as some people are learning about it, we thought it was important to have a conversation about what Juneteenth is and the people who are most affected by it. So let me bring in first the founder of People for Liberty, Lauren Postler. Hey, Lauren, how's it going?
Hey, Dan. Coming to y'all live from Georgetown in Texas, where I'm celebrating Father's Day with my family.
That's nice. You sound great. Tell me a little bit about what's on our schedule for today.
Yeah, Dan, I'm very excited. And, you know, Dan, you and I are native Texans, so certainly Juneteenth is very near and dear to us as it was launched here in Texas, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But we have a stellar lineup of individuals who are going to be sharing from their perspective. Aaron Shafer, who's a member of our Black Voters for Liberty group, is going to be joining us. Jeremy Thompson, who recorded the spoken word video that many of you saw over social media recently. Larry Sharpe, John Monds, Dr. Aaron Lewis. These are true thought leaders in the liberty movement. And that's one of the things that People for Liberty is committed to. We are committed to helping people who are curious about liberty engage with thought leaders who are helping to communicate the principles of liberty in our daily lives. So every time we have an online event, a live streaming, and we bring in guests, it's to help them engage with each of you, and then to help our groups engage with each other and activate their communities with an eye towards action. You know, up until recently, so much of the world was still shut down. Now that we have the opportunity to connect in person again, we've started traveling, we're looking forward to in-person events, and we want to share with you all our strategic plan and the opportunities for action that we have outlined. Because we're not just online groups. We are not just online events. We are an organization dedicated to action, to bringing people curious about liberty, the movement. So if you have not yet, please sign up for our newsletter at peopleforliberty.org. We are going to be sending out an exclusive invitation to participate in a Zoom webinar where we will go through our strategic plan with those curious about our goals, our mission, and our vision for the future. But today, let's get back to Juneteenth.
Yeah, and I just want to tell people that if they go to the People for Liberty news site, go to any one of our articles, peopleforliberty.org, go to any one of our articles. There's a newsletter link. You'll get a pop-up if you're on the page for more than 30 minutes. Easy cheesy to sign up for the newsletter. All you have to do is put your email address in.
You know what, Dan? I do want people to see my shirt. So
all right.
These shirts are available on our website. And you know what I told my dad? I said, Dad, the second F word is family.
That's a good second F word. I appreciate that. And, Father's Day is a good day to celebrate. I guess fathers can be the third F word. Freedom is the first, though. Nothing exists without that. So exactly. Who are we bringing on right now for our first conversation, Lauren?
Well, let's bring on Holly Ward, our new vice president of the board of directors, and let's bring on Dr. Joe Jorgensen, the president of our board. We're so excited to have y'all with us today. Hey, Holly. Hey, Joe.
Hey.
I still get excited to say President Joe Jorgensen.
So, I mentioned that we're both Texans. You grew up in Galveston, the center of so much.
I grew up in Galveston, which for people who don't know about Juneteenth, the origin is based in Galveston, Texas, where the Union General at the time issued the proclamation that then spread throughout the South. But for millennials who don't know, there weren't always cell phones. There wasn't even always telephones. It was difficult for information to get out. And it took a long time for slaves to be told that, or anybody to be told that slavery was over. And as a result, that's why the ambiguous name of Juneteenth. And in fact, I liked the fact that it is this ambiguous thing because it talks about how systemic slavery was in the South. And in fact, there's a great example of that not only was it that sometimes word didn't reach out, but some I guess we can't say less than ethical slave owners, because if you were a slave owner, you were already less than ethical. But some
Yeah.
slave owners didn't tell their slaves that they were free. And in fact, a lot of the work of the Union Army was to travel around and spread the word manually to people who hadn't been told that they were free. Now, that thing about traveling around and spreading the word, that was one of the most amazing things that happened during the Libertarian presidential campaign, because there was only one presidential candidate who went to George Floyd Square, and that was Dr. Joe. So, Joe, Dr. Jorgensen, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, we were spreading the word that, hey, I was the only presidential candidate who went to George Floyd Square on Juneteenth. And then throughout the rest of the campaign, we realized that I was the only one, I believe, who ever went there, period. Because I don't think that Biden or Trump went there, not only not on Juneteenth, but also the entire rest of the campaign. And in fact, there was a Fox News reporter there, and somebody went over and said, hey, we've got a presidential candidate over here, if you'd like, because he was standing there at George Floyd Square with the microphone. And we said, hey, we got a presidential candidate here if you'd like to interview her. And he was just looked puzzled and was like, nah. And now I do realize, I mean, he had no way of kind of knowing who I am, since we haven't broken through to major media. But it would have taken a quick phone call to find out very quickly that, yes, that was me and I was there to interview us. So, no, unfortunately, that didn't get spread around too widely, that we were there, we were showing our compassion, we were trying to listen. And part of this was a listening tour to listen to what the problems are. And there is a huge, important overlap between libertarians and Black Lives Matter. And that is that we both realize there is a huge problem. We both see that the system needs to be changed. Now, the difference, of course, is that with libertarians, we believe that there should be more freedom, not less. And one of probably my most rewarding days on the trail was actually later on, and was actually in a different state when I met with the Black Lives Matter leader. And he, a wonderful guy, he turned his life around. He was a Black pastor, had been in prison, and we just chit-chatted. And I just, a one-on-one conversation, explained liberty, explained our beliefs. And one of the things I pointed out, since he was a felon, I said, well, so I guess you can't really own a gun, can you? And he said, oh, well, of course not, I'm a felon. And I said, libertarians believe that just because you've been to prison doesn't mean that now for the rest of your life, you're not allowed to protect yourself, that you shouldn't lose the right to life. Right. You shouldn't lose the right to life, liberty, and property. And he thought, and he said, I never thought of it that way. And I said, absolutely. You paid your debt to society. You're out. You have the right to protect yourself. And I also talked about what I talked about on the campaign trail several times, Rosa Parks. And I said, of course, you know the story of Rosa Parks. And he said, of course. And I said, now, did you realize that that was a government-run, government-owned bus that was telling Blacks, including Rosa Parks, to sit on the back of? And he said, no, I had no idea. And I said, it's only through the power of government that people can be discriminated against so badly. Because imagine Uber or Lyft discriminating against the majority of their customers, because at that time, about 60% of the bus ridership were Blacks. So imagine in the free market, you discriminating against the best 60% of your customers. You would go out of business as well, you should. And he said, wow, these are really interesting. So again, we completely share with Black Lives Matter the idea that something needs to be done, that the system is broken. And what I was having a great time doing was sharing the message of liberty with people who hadn't heard it before.
One of the critical things too, you talked about the fact that you went there to listen. It wasn't a publicity event. You weren't there for any other reason. And in fact, we didn't bring a camera crew or broadcast anything. The fact there was a Fox News reporter there, but that's very different than what a lot of people did when they went to George Floyd Square. It was a photo opportunity. It was a press event. you were there to listen. And I think that distinguishes the difference between a libertarian campaign and an old party campaign.
Yeah, and by the way, and that's what I did too with the Black Lives Matter leader, because I said, tell me about yourself, tell me about your background, tell me about your organization. And we just had the most wonderful conversation that pretty much lasted all day. We met in the morning, and then we later had lunch, and I invited him as my guest to the local state convention that evening and had a great discussion. And we, this is the way that people should be in the world. We talk about world leaders meeting. We just sat there and had a true conversation where we actually listened to each other and offered suggestions.
Well, and Joe, I want to clarify for, people that didn't get the whole truth or only got partial truth about that conversation that you had. This was in no way, shape, or form an endorsement of the Black Lives Matter organization. It was you taking the opportunity to learn from people who had concerns about the state of our country. And
Right.
That does not mean we endorsed a Marxist or a communist organization, which we heard so many people decry, but you taking the opportunity to listen. The press and the media was going to spin that however they wanted. I'm glad you had the opportunity today to clarify for people that were curious. We're not endorsing an organization. We are endorsing a message that resonates.
You're
Right.
absolutely right. And the reason why I wanted to talk to him is, like I said, they're halfway there. They at least realize there's a problem. So I would rather talk with people who agree with us that there's a problem than to talk with people who say, oh, everything's fine, there's no problem. So they're halfway there. So let's spread the idea of liberty and show them how liberty is such an awesome solution.
Right. And I think
I love it.
we can all agree with the sentence, Black Lives Matter. It's a critical thing.
Not the organization, but the message. And I think our next guest, Jeremy Thompson, is going to help shed some light on his perspective on the message and the movement, not the organization, but the cause and the opportunity to champion that cause that we have today.
All right. Let me bring
the world is better with more freedom.
Let me bring Jeremy in. Jeremy, Massachusetts brethren, what's up, man?
What's going on, Dan?
Not much. So I think we should start off with the video that you made. It's been around on the internet already. We've gotten a lot of things, but let me just fire that up because I think people are going to be very excited to see this. If for people who haven't, it's obviously available on YouTube as well. But I think it's very important that people see The Black Constitution by Jeremy Chandler.
Basic constitutional rights are not absolute. Keep your hands up and stay silent for the man in blue. Let him read you your rights so he will not shoot. Like, boy, it does not matter what you did or did not. The First Amendment does not apply to you. With blackness as a weapon, neither does the second. In black criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy a quick and speedy sentencing by a partial jury of the state and district wherein the crime of blackness has been committed. So remember, the 14th never included peace. And sadly, ain't nothing gonna change until we see the problem is more than the police. The system has always been broken. And the only thing changed has been the chains.
Really powerful. And the fact that you say the only thing that's changed has been the chains. It's that's a common liberty theme. You want to talk about that sentence a little bit, and then we'll get more into sort of some of the stuff that you're doing in Boston?
Sure. So what I mean by that sentence necessarily is that a lot of what we consider to be slavery, or at least government oppression, has been changed throughout the years for especially like the black population, right? When we talk about how black people are treated in the eyes of like the law, we are completely hit with different sentences. For instance, we could talk about the crack versus cocaine epidemic, specifically in the legal field. We could talk about how we're still dealing with the effects of the drug war. We could talk about how, slaves are being put in prison and forced to work for like different companies who may buy it out for like extremely low wages, subpar, honestly, by any standard of measurement. and we can really just talk about how the system has like a history of like normalizing Black death. So that's why I say the only thing that has changed has been the chains, because we are facing modern forms of older issues. Yeah.
So Jeremy, I know when I first talked to you, and we're gonna get into this a little bit later, so I don't want to get too much into it. But the poem itself, we were talking to you as a speaker, and you immediately came out with this poem, and you said, "Can I perform it to you?" And my favorite part, Jeremy, was that you were on the streets in Boston working with people while the poem came out. And I listened, and I was so moved. And so, Jeremy, I know we're gonna chat a little bit later and a bit more in depth. But for specifically your poem, can you just kind of walk us through why and how you felt that resonated with yourself and the community that you're reaching out to for liberty?
Yeah, so the community I mainly reach out to is the unhoused and communities facing addiction. So how that resonates with us is we see a lot of state abuses, and the issue of methadone denial that I've been trying to address with other community leaders has been an issue created by the state itself for about 30 years now. It's every year we get folks, every election cycle we get folks running that they're going to fix it, and they do worse for the problem. Every time we want any change in the city, our rehabs are being sold to developers for housing. The city right now is in a battle with another city just to reopen Long Island, which would provide rehabilitation for like thousands of people. And if you do a cost analysis, that's better than the city selling out a ton of funds to the nonprofits that they have centralized around the area that do nothing to solve these issues. We could talk about how, there are state hospitals that are being funded for the tests that they run on these people when they really only want a soda and a sandwich. Like a lot of these folks, for instance, will come in for a soda and a sandwich, and they'll have MRIs, CAT scans, and STI testing done on them, just to boost BMC's numbers in the eyes of the state.
So, Jeremy, I just want to make sure, I know later you're going to talk a lot more about your activism and your engagement in Boston, but in the beginning, and especially with this poem, I'd love to hear more about how you kind of intermingled your creative aspect. And then if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear the poem live, and I think our audience would as well.
Yeah, I'd absolutely willing to perform the entire poem live. But where did this come from? Well, at least the first part, it came from a conversation with me and my dad, actually. When I was 10 years old, a cop had pulled me and my mother over, because she was driving me to school. I come from a poor background. She was driving me to school, and her license, I believe, was expired or something like that. Or her registration needed to be renewed. And
so, Jeremy, this is, shocker to our audience. I'm not Black, but I've heard about driving with Black, and almost every person of color that I know has talked about the talk, and the sound. It's so heartbreaking, and I think a lot of people aren't familiar with the talk. So.
Oh yeah, and this is it. That's exactly the conversation I'm going to get into, right? When I'm literally 10 years old, sitting in the passenger side of my mom's car, but for some reason the cop decides to walk up to the passenger side first with his hand already on his gun. My mom goes ballistic. She's like, "What are you doing? First of all, that's a kid. He's on the passenger side. Why are you asking him for his license and registration? This isn't his car. That doesn't make any type of sense. This is a procedure." And then being young, I didn't understand anything why she was going off like that. I was like, it's whatever. And then I have a talk with my dad, and this is right before I get introduced to the world of activism. We had this talk, whereas as a Black boy in America, I'm going to be treated differently, right? And this is a talk I'm going to have to have with my kids, because as Black people, it's a survival thing, right? You need to we are taught to learn how to exist within the system and how to talk to police from a very young age. So it's more of a survival thing, where most kids are having like the sex talk, the puberty talk, we're getting the cop talk, right? And that's the most. Across the board, there has been no other higher form of engagement of like Black parenting in their kids' lives, right? Navigating the police system is something that all of my family members have gone through, be it either directly or indirectly by knowing someone, or literally just having an experience with a cop who may have been a really bad person. But that's why I mentioned that part about basic constitutional rights not applying to people. And as I get into it, I go more in depth, because there's certain things you can't say to a cop, otherwise, like, that'll trigger them, right? That'll make them do way more.
So, Jeremy, I would love right now to hear your poem live. I think our audience would like to hear your poem live. And I know we're getting a lot of feedback about where we can find your poem. We would love to be able to share your poem and get it up so people have the text as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, please, Jeremy, we'd love to hear a live rendition of the Black Constitution.
Sure. Black folks, remember, basic constitutional rights are not absolute. Keep your hands up and stay silent for the man in blue. Let him read you your rights so he will not shoot. Black boy, it does not matter what you did or did not do. The First Amendment does not apply to you. With blackness as a weapon, neither does the second. Don't you dare bring up the fourth, or the pig will apply force. Let him search through your car. He has quotas to enforce. For my Americans, the 6 states, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. But Black people, this don't apply to you. The Black Sixth Amendment states such: in Black criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy a quick and speedy sentencing by a partial jury of the state and district wherein the crime of blackness has been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to remain misinformed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the most useless assistance of low-tier counsel for his defense. This is more than a feeling of hatred from what Republicans want to call an isolated incidents. Time and time again, history repeats itself, but each time they act like there wasn't already precedence. Racism running deep in our country's DNA, from the DAs to the president. A whole country founded on bloodshed, like the red in our flag is something we should be proud to represent. But our racists turned in the white sheets for the blue uniforms. A whole lot of bad apples, and the good ones allow them to poison us. The system is poisonous. Got a Black man anxious to leave his house. It's crazy how they're torturing us. But our old leaders passed the torch to us, and our generation is furious. We stand up and fight back, but notice these fake activists don't got our backs. People out Karen always got a Black friend whenever she feel attacked. We ashamed to explain this nexus of racism, but we got to. For the next generation of kids who got kids raising them, perk popping and sipping lean to eliminate those thoughts plaguing them. But the 14th never included peace. Sadly, nothing gonna change till we see the problem as more than the police. And yes, the system is broken, and the only thing changed has been the chains. So this Juneteenth, remember our names and our fight. Invoke Black liberation, because that is a principle left behind by the Constitution. We fight demanding damages in a resolution. Hence why today we celebrate a revolution. Thank you.
Amazing. There's a natural segue there where you talk about the tradition being handed down. And we've got a guy on with us who has been in the Liberty Movement for a while, but also has been around. And so I'm just going to bring him in with you for a second. John Monds, thank you so much for being able to join us. You're in North Carolina right now, right?
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me. Absolutely, over here in Greensboro.
So you're a guy who you've been in the Liberty Movement for a long time. And I want to go back to that. But with Jeremy on and his poem talking about the transfer of tradition, and I know you to be a Morehouse man as well, that tradition, if you could talk a little bit about what that means of transferring the knowledge of what you've seen to African-American youth now, and especially in the Liberty Movement.
Absolutely. I think that passing on what we know, what we've experienced is very important, to be able to learn lessons and share that, not just with the youth, but with anybody that we come across. Part of being in the Liberty Movement has been an education for myself. I really think that getting out and speaking is important. Not one, getting the story right and correct, sharing a possibly different perspective than most people would get. So, it's very important to pass on, what we know.
That's and that sort of thing, I think, is a thing about it. We just had this really emotional poem from Jeremy, and I think that's I think that sometimes people can be removed, especially people who, for them, all they see of Black Lives Matter is on television. All they see is this remote participation, and they don't understand how emotionally charged this is. And so, Jeremy, thank you very much for the gift of sharing that emotion with us. And if it's still hard for you, right? I mean, you wrote this a while ago, and it still comes from the heart, man. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this wasn't just written from an emotional place. This is a state I'm constantly in, right? 2020 highlighted that when I was a medic for the protest out there. But even just living my daily life, like, I have to watch where I'm at. I have to watch how I talk to police. I have to watch a whole different slew of things, even city officials, because some of these people are petty. The work never stops. So I'm constantly in this mind state of, how can we make change for all? How can we make it happen? And that is all that those emotions are always going to keep coming up, no matter what. I think this poem is just honestly a vehicle for me to show people what's constantly in the back of my mind as I work for liberty.
Well, Jeremy, we're going to hear a lot from you later about your personal journey to liberty and how you've brought that emotion and experience into action, and how you're helping to make your experience and relationship with the government and liberty translate into meaningful work that helps to set people free. So thank you, Jeremy. And for those, I'm seeing everything flooding in. We're going to get the text for Jeremy's poem up. Absolutely. That's something I think will be uplifting. And Jeremy, we'll dive more later into your personal experience in liberty. So thank you. Thank you for opening us up, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And Dan,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think you have a great journey now that's about to be discussed with Mr. Monds.
I do. And so, John Monds, you were candidate for vice president. You were the first libertarian to get over 1 million votes who wasn't running for president, which is just an astonishing feature, especially in Georgia. Can you tell the people who aren't familiar with your story about your path to liberty? How did you come to run as a libertarian?
I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but I'd like to explain to people I was politically homeless for a long time. While in college, I worked on a local state house campaign in Georgia, and there was 2 Democratic candidates, and that experience really soured me on politics. So from that time to after I was married and had 2 children, I didn't get involved anyway in a political system. But early 2000s, what was going on in the world with the wars and just feeling that I needed to say something and do something, I looked at all the political parties in Georgia at the time so I could get active. And what I found, that's how I found the Libertarian Party. I read the platform and said, man, this is for me. I mean, it's about being free. That's the bottom line, getting the state out of our lives. So around 2004 is when I joined. I just went to a Georgia convention and didn't know anybody, hadn't really even heard of Libertarian Party, but I stepped out, met some great folks. And the first time I ran for office was in 2006. And I've been active ever since. And I plan on remaining active.
That's the fact that you're remaining is a critical thing, because we're talking about, a long-term struggle. And for me, there's a lot of times that in the liberty movement, I sometimes despair. We haven't set the world free in our lifetime yet. But for you in Georgia, right, the civil rights struggle was long, right? It was perseverance. It was people continuing to fight.
Absolutely. I mean, when you, and it's just not the civil rights era. I mean, for people of color, um, this fight has been going on for hundreds of years, in this country. So, and there has been progress. Um, but I mean, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So, I've talked about previously at, I think, the Georgia Convention, the time that we have is now, and we can't look back and say what we might have done if we lived in a different era. What we have to focus on is the era that we live in, which is right now. And being in the liberty movement is tough if you don't see, being a party, you want to win elections. And for a lot of people, that can be very disappointing, knowing going in that in many races, you have little chance of victory. And, that can really get to folks. But we have to learn that there's other ways that we can win without necessarily being elected. The goal is always to be elected, but we can make our mark in just running, quality campaigns and educating voters. And we build this momentum to hopefully reach a tipping point when, more and more people are saying, are looking, and we just have to make sure that we're ready to accept them.
You talk about educating the voter, and that's one of the things that I think it's an experience that every libertarian has had, where we talk to people and we explain some of the stuff that we believe in, and they've never heard anything like that before. The idea of, there are things that we can do that the government has done poorly, and taking it away from them doesn't mean it won't get done. It just means that we've done by people. And there's a lot of activism. And specifically, we see a lot of that in tight communities. And you're based in Atlanta, right? Outside of Atlanta?
I live in South Georgia. It's about 3.5 hours south of Atlanta, actually closer to the Florida border. I'm about 20 minutes from Florida.
Gotcha. That'd be a good name for a country line. Florida, Georgia border. Well, no. But so I'm willing to bet that, there are communities there that do a good job of taking care of each other. When somebody's in trouble, somebody in the community is willing to step up, and it doesn't have to be government that does that, right?
And that is a tradition. I mean, we have to look at before we had all this government in our lives, we actually had stronger families. We had stronger church communities. We had stronger local school communities. And yes, these different organizations, if you call them, did very well of taking care of the local community. And as we've grown, the government, these institutions, have themselves, their impact, has gone down. And in essence, the communities have suffered because of that. So, we just have to tell that story and say that, hey, this is, either from a historic perspective, how it used to be and how much better it was than it is even now. But yeah, I mean, that's what goes on. You help your neighbors if they need help in any way possible. And that's what's still going on in a lot of communities.
And, you're talking about the tradition and, the fact that to a certain extent, the government has really been undermining that tradition. We're sort of faced with the opposite end of that, in that, certainly for me, seeing the government recognize Juneteenth and making it a federal holiday, on the one hand, I'm very happy for the recognition. On the other hand, the idea that it's the government that made it a holiday, right? That it was something we always celebrated already, or at least for me in the South. And I know my northern friends didn't. I'm guessing in Georgia, you guys celebrated Juneteenth even before the federal government said it was a holiday.
Right. I'm kind of a cynic, especially when it comes to government. And the fact that the government declared it a holiday, the fact that they may not realize that a lot of different communities, don't celebrate Juneteenth because they had other days that they celebrated. For example, my father's hometown, small Upson County in Georgia, they call it the 29th because May the 29th is when they heard, and they've celebrated that every year since 1863. Where I live in South Georgia, they call it, their May Day is May the 20th. That's in South Georgia, like in Cairo and Thomasville, and also in Tallahassee, of course, in North Florida, because that's when they heard. And those communities, a lot of the celebrations, though, have fallen by the wayside. They're not as strong as they used to be. But, Juneteenth is a Texas holiday, really. I mean, so it's not the same, but, I guess they're just gonna, put everybody all together into one day.
You're hitting the nail on the head there. That and I just got to say, University of Texas graduate, hook 'em. But the thing about it is that was part of what was awesome about the celebration, is that it was different in other places, and that you have the May celebrations and it runs all the way through. And for me, that was part of what connected us to that era, is understanding that it wasn't an era of instant communication. And it wasn't either. That's the other thing about it, is like, I'm really worried that people are going to think, suddenly government snapped its fingers and slavery was over. Because that's not what happened either. And Juneteenth is supposed to be, we talked about a little bit at the outset, it's an ambiguous name because it recognizes the fact that it's not one specific day. It's not June 19th, it's Juneteenth. But this broad celebration of the ending of slavery, and a lot of people say slavery is the original sin of the United States. We don't get to say, well, one day absolves everything about that. We're going to have one day that ends it. I liked it better when it was a longer celebration. But I do, I'm gonna quote Dr. King throughout the day. But the arc of history is long, but it tends towards justice. We're getting better at that sort of thing. At least a recognition of there's a responsibility for Americans to recognize that there was systemic racism, there is systemic racism, and that slavery was an American issue, and that we should celebrate the ending of that. Because you can argue about all the terrible things that happened, but there was an effort to end slavery in the United States as well. And that's, I don't have to say things aren't getting perfect, but for you as a guy who's been here for a long time, how much do you feel things have moved in your lifetime?
Well, some things have moved forward and others have moved backwards. I mean, we've made strides, but because we can see that how much government's in our lives right now. If we look back, to 1865 or so, and ask what our ancestors were able to do back then that we can't do today, we'll see that there's been progress made. But we always have to, put things in context. The Emancipation Proclamation was just that. It was a proclamation. And to me, thinking that the government has the power, one, to enslave people and then to free them is a very dangerous proposition. We have to keep in mind that the enemy is the state. And one thing that we need to do in the African-American community is realize that most of the things and battles that we've faced, whether historically from slavery to Jim Crow, peonage laws, housing discrimination, educational discrimination, those things are rooted in the state. So until we get the state out of our lives, we're going to have masters and be slaves. I mean, the 13th Amendment, once again, it ended chattel slavery. But of course, the exception was, if you were convicted of a crime, then you can become a slave to the state. And so what happened? We see that they turn everything into a crime, and their purview over your life. So once again, I mean, it's great that I think it's really symbolic what they're doing. I think it's in some ways a chance for primarily the Democratic Party to try to shore up their base. Hey, look what we're doing. But the substance of what they're doing, as far as making not only African Americans freer, but the entire population of the country freer, I mean, is abysmal. And they have a track record that shows that. And that's what we need to concentrate on.
And then that's a critical thing. And you're a guy who gives a lot of his life to the liberty movement. You're in North Carolina right now. Can you tell us briefly what you're doing there? And then we'll let you go and do what you've traveled to do.
Well, I was invited to the Libertarian Party North Carolina's convention. They have me slated to speak in about an hour or so. And tell my story. I'll be talking about Juneteenth, some of the things that I brought up today, and hopefully share what I believe is a path forward for not only the party having successes, but I think the entire country.
That's wonderful. We really appreciate it. You know, this is a guy who's not sitting at home in front of his computer or anything like that, on the road for liberty in North Carolina. John Monds, thank you for everything that you've done. And we are very appreciative of you taking the time to be on the show.
I appreciate you having me. And that went very smooth, Dan, unlike last time of our inside joke.
Well, I have to explain just a little bit. The last time John and I did a Juneteenth episode last year, we had an intruder break into my house during the show. And so, yeah, that was pretty crazy. And the nice thing about it, though, is you talk about a guy who's dedicated to liberty. John stepped up. I just had to run, and he hosted the rest of the show. It was amazing. And so, fortunately, that hasn't happened so far. We got an hour left in the broadcast. But thank you very much, John. And I look forward to the day that we get together in person again.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. And so now, Holly and Lauren, you know, we've done a fair bit of content here. I imagine that, you know, you guys, there's stuff to say about what we've seen so far.
Yes. So that was really emotional. And I think it's really hard to figure out how everyone can have an active role. And I know for me, my moment, I had somebody tell me a story, and this isn't my story, but it's a relevant story. So somebody was explaining to me a few years ago about the movement of Black Lives Matter and where a lot was coming from. And I was really trying to listen and understand. And they said, well, here's an example. Grab a Band-Aid. I was like, oh, okay. And I did.
Yeah.
And I took a Band-Aid out, and they said, okay, do you have anything to say about the Band-Aid? And I said, no, it's just a Band-Aid. And then the person said, have you ever realized that the Band-Aid will never match my skin tone? I had never thought about that. I had never realized with my own unconscious bias that was a conversation and narrative. And from there, I realized that, you know, I can't tell the story of a person of color. I'm not a person of color, but I can amplify. I can be an ally. And so, Lauren, I'd love to hear what moment brought you to being an amplifier and an ally in the fight for justice and equity.
Well, and I love that illustration, Holly, because it's something that people can grasp. And when we talk about some of these broad concepts of freedom and liberty and, you know, certainly the civil rights movement as a whole, sometimes I think it's hard to understand how we can amplify and bring action to these emotional topics and these, you know, broad concepts. And so looking for opportunities for action is where I was last year when George Floyd was murdered. And, you know, I think this might resonate with certainly people curious about the liberty movement. You know, I had voted Republican for a really long time because the economic principles, you know, appealed to me. But, you know, the divisiveness among the two parties was so front and center during George Floyd's murder and so much of this civil unrest in our country last year. And I can't do this anymore. It is not enough for me to be a good listener. It is not enough for me to support my Black and brown friends and I live in Houston. We're a very international community. I also work closely with veterans. And Holly, you can attest to this. Certainly in the veteran community, it's a great equalizer. You see people from all walks of life. We've had the opportunity to work and love and cherish and be friends and family with people from different perspectives and different worldviews. And that includes people from, the Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, those communities. So when I was sitting there thinking, what can I do to take action, to not just be an ally in name, but to put my money where my mouth is and to do something that's meaningful, that was really where the concept of People for Liberty came to life. We had these groups that were, exchanging ideas about liberty, sharing information about George Jorgensen as a candidate. And I said, we need to take more action. And for me, that was breaking the cycle of the duopoly, that you heard one narrative pitting against another narrative, but no true action, no true allies. It was we're against them against us. And I said, if I want to be an ally, I have to find a place and a path to meaningful action that has nothing to do with politics today. If I was to take action in a way that resonated with my values for individual responsibility, personal liberty, and taking action in voluntarism,
Yes.
what does that look like?
Absolutely. I think seeing it in action, and specifically, we're talking here about liberty and individual liberties. And there's a huge correlation that I think is starting to really come to light. I know for myself, I was still, in serving as a federal employee, and I became a co-chair for the Black and African American Employment Strategy Team. After George Floyd was murdered, I said, okay, where is our action? What are we doing? And,
yes, as allies.
And we came together, and a great group of a great team was built. And, fighting for equity and justice, but also identifying where individual liberties are limited.
Yes.
Going through policies and laws was not the most exciting. And I think it's important to persevere through this. There's so much, I think, in part of this broadcast, we're talking about Juneteenth, but it's not over. It's not finished. There's still so much more work to do and where we go. And so, and in part of my time, I remember there was a regulation stating that if you had a waiver for pseudobarbic folliculitis, which is like shaving bumps, which is something that typically presents itself in the Black and African American community and the Hispanic community. If you had a waiver for that, you couldn't apply for these specialized jobs. And I couldn't believe that still existed. And so, okay, I can't walk in and, give some of my experience as being a person of color shaving. I can't do that. I can't explain the discrimination when it hasn't happened to me, but I can go in and highlight and amplify people, because that's not my story to tell. That's not my experience to tell. And I can be an ally by writing the policies and helping to write the laws and helping to bring the barriers that already exist into acknowledgement. I think that's so important, and anybody can do it.
And Holly, I think this ties to what we are trying to do now, is connecting opportunities to action to legislation and registration. On our page at peopleforliberty.org, we have an opportunity for people to submit information about local regulations, about laws and legislation where they've deemed them as fighting against personal liberty. So the opportunity to identify those barriers, those are ways that we as allies can lift our voices and amplify others to make sure that everyone has the same kind of access to freedom. And it's so important, the little things. I mean, Holly, you've had dozens of stories that you've shared about identifying barriers to access. And in the federal government, this is inclusive of our military and in, all across the board.
But even so, Lauren, I would say that having that conversation, and then having that conversation acknowledging your unconscious bias. So I know during my tenure of being a co-chair, for that group and organization, I heard so many stories for areas I had never even thought of, never even considered. Driving while Black was a phrase I'd never heard in my entire life. And then I had somebody tell me about it. And it blew me away, the story after story after story after story of how real that was. And so when we're having these conversations and when we're present, understanding and acknowledging your own unconscious biases is definitely huge. And I know I'm excited for Juneteenth, just because I feel like our representation and what we see in what's supposed to be a very democratic society, I don't think that's inclusive of our entire population. And I don't think anyone is really trying to listen. I don't think anyone's trying to have the conversation. And I love that we're having that conversation. I got goosebumps from it listening to John Monds, Jeremy's poem. Like that's so vital to have the conversation.
Oh, I was crying. Yeah.
It was.
And you know, Holly, what kills me is that there is, again, the duopoly has set us up to be one against the other, that they are right, we are wrong. And, you know, I think part of the liberty movement is acknowledging that all voices have a place. And for me, this cry out against being woke for the sake of being woke, when I think about being an ally, for me, that's about being aware. And I have a distinction in my mind about not being woke for the sake of wokeness, but being aware in order to be an ally, in order to amplify and take action. I am aware. That doesn't mean I'm woke. In the negative connotation, it's come to really, I think, be decried in society today. You can be aware in order to be an ally.
Well, and being an ally and being woke, and any phrase that comes along with the territory of trying to navigate this conversation, at the end of the day, the conversation's about liberty and meeting people where they are in their experience with liberty. And I think everybody has a different relationship with liberty. Someone from the gay and sexual minority community, some from the Black and Indigenous people of color community, someone that's a woman, someone that's a man. All of our relationships with liberty and where the government has infringed on our liberties are going to be wildly different. And making sure that we have a liberty-based conversation, meeting people where they are, meeting them where their infringements with liberties in the government has come in. I think that's so vital.
So critical.
We have to keep it going.
And understanding those stories, I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast that we are going to be sharing our strategic plan for People for Liberty and opportunities for action. I can't wait to talk about our, Liberty at the Border initiative with Libertarios Hispanos and tracking legislation and engaging people in opportunities for action. So if you're just now tuning in, please subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get an invitation to tune into our exclusive Zoom where we'll go through our strategic plan together. But Holly, you're going to be talking about the economics of liberty next with Germinal, right?
Yes, and I'm so excited. Germinal has given us such a huge background on economics and his relationship with that, and I'm so happy for him to tell his story. It looks like we do have a bit of a camera situation with Germinal at the moment. So
well, I'll say while we're waiting for him to come up, let me brag on you a little bit because you are very humble and you won't bring this up. Tell people about the PhD you're currently working on, which ties to freedom and economics.
Yeah, it does. So, and thank you. I try not to push that too much. So
I will.
I feel like all of us, we witnessed the federal budget being built and developed, and there's no say in it. There's no public authority in it. It's developed by the administration out of the executive powers. It's voted on by House and Senate arms or budgetary committees and appropriations committees, and the public never gets to have a say. So I'm analyzing the public authority representation of the federal budget and what phases and processes have the most and least amount of public authority. And then the second, shocker, there's not a lot of public representation in the budget. I'll cut all that research out and spare some time. But the second portion is great. So how can we include the public and have public authority and representation in the budget itself? But I will, push that away because I've read enough academic articles on federal budget processing to think about it in my sleep. And without further ado, I would love to bring up Germinal G-Man. Germinal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Holly. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good, thank you.
So Germinal, I remember when we first were talking and looking for speakers for today's event, you introduced financial literacy, and I thought another unconscious bias. I thought I I don't understand why we need to talk about finances. So can you give us a little bit of insight here, Germinal, on why we do need to talk about finances, and especially on Juneteenth?
Yeah, sure. Because financial literacy is something that we don't teach us at school. You will never see a course of financial literacy, how we're going to teach you how to manage your own money. This is something you learn on the spot. And it is important on Juneteenth specifically because this is an opportunity for more Blacks to understand how money works. Because we tend, specifically in this country, to blame rich people for becoming wealthier, whereas there is a set of techniques that they use to multiply their money. And those techniques that they use to multiply the money is not rocket science. There are plenty of ways, plenty of assets that they invest the money in. And it is important that Black people started to also understand how it works. So where to invest your money, how to invest it, and how do you know that this asset is going to pay back in the near future or in the long term. So financial literacy is crucial. And the other reason why it is crucial, because once you understand how money works, you can change lives with it. Because someone who has, let me give this very simple example. Let's say you were $50 million. Do you know how much you can do with 50 million? You can literally change an entire community, like an entire neighborhood. You can build infrastructures. You can do like real estate development, build infrastructures, like make properties accessible to people. There's a lot of things you can do that will improve the lives of people. And what is interesting is that this is stuff you don't even need politics to do it. It's your own initiative you have. That's why the more people are aware about how money works, the better it is for everyone, because we become more mindful about the power and value of money.
Now, Germinal, I think specifically today, talking about financial literacy and how it relates to the Black and African American community, a lot of folks aren't aware of things like Black Wall Street, and that financial literacy is something that has been suppressed by the government, specifically in the Black and African American community, for a long time. I'd love to hear more about your experience and the work that you do with how the government has actually kind of helped to perpetuate this narrative.
Yeah, and I even said that, in fact, the reason why we have this oppressive system is because of the government, because the government, at the end of the day, people have been saying, yes, white people are racist and blah, 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 but it is impossible, logically impossible, to enslave someone through market means. You can't. Because even the racist guy who opens his business...
Well, I would argue through free market means.
Yeah, that's what I mean, through free market means. Because the racist guy who opens his business needs to make profit. So he's willing to take the money of anybody. But when you have a government now that has the possibility to completely eradicate that system, but instead decide to perpetuate it, then that's what the real issue is. And that's what the government of the United States has done for a very long time. Instead of granting Black people their rights, not just in theory, but in practice, it just left them, specifically in the South, being oppressed by those local and state governments of sovereign states. And that unfortunately has prevented Black people to have early access to better opportunities. Today, thank God, like, things have improved, but we still feel the wounds,
Yeah, well, Germinal, do you think the work of education and overcoming the barriers is the work done?
The work is not done, but I would like to say that it is in progress. And education is, as Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon to change society. More people needs to be educated. And when I say education, it's not necessarily formal education like academic education, but all forms of education that can improve people's understanding of how the world works. And financial literacy, as we talked about earlier, is one way to educate themselves, because, and this is something that people, first of all, will never learn, as I said, in school. They will learn it only on their own through the actions and their experience.
So, Germinal, we're talking on Juneteenth about freedom, right? Freedom is the conversation of the day, but it's not just physical freedom. There's also economic freedom, and you have a great piece about property rights and economic freedom. Can you elaborate more on how you think property rights and economic freedoms tie together?
Yeah, of course, because freedom comes with responsibility. In fact, that is the real definition of freedom. People tend to think that you're free, but you don't, there's no consequences coming with your actions. And the reason why property is the epitome of economic freedom is because only you, as Milton Friedman says, no one else will manage your property better than you. So only you know the time, effort, and resources you've spent to manage your property. So when you let someone else, let's say it's the government, manage your property, you know that the government will never manage your property better than you. And on top of that, right?
Does the government know that, Terminal? Does the government know that yet?
No, of course. I mean, I'm sure they know, but they don't care. That's the problem. And why they don't care? Because they know that they will never pay the price if they make the wrong decisions about it. But if you mismanage your own resources, you have to pay the consequences of it. That's why property leads to economic freedom, because the more efficient you are about the management of your resources, the better it becomes in terms of generating profit, because people see the value that you're bringing into the market. That's why we have so many wealthy people in this country. At the end of the day, yes, some people may have inherited from the money of the family and blah, blah, blah. But if they were not responsible about the money they've got, they would have not been able to multiply. And that's a fact. You cannot, if you're not responsible about the resources you have at your disposal, you're going to blow away those resources that you could use to create more stuff. So freedom is responsibility, and property rights is the best means to reflect freedom.
Absolutely. And for those, we're getting flooded with requests right now. We're going to have a longer Liberty lunch with Germinal, because Germinal, you have had just some really good conversation and stuff that I don't think we can do you justice trying to fit you into a smaller time block. So for anybody that's asking for more information, we're going to have Germinal on for another Liberty lunch. We're going to really dig in depth and go down. And one way that you can keep in touch with that is by subscribing to our newsletter. Subscribing to the People for Liberty newsletter. We're going to be sending out all of our information. You'll be able to keep in touch with who we have that's coming up to speak next. And Germinal, you're one of those people. So just want to make sure that folks know that we're going to be hearing a lot more from Germinal coming in the future.
Absolutely.
So Germinal, we're talking a little bit here about wealth and maintaining wealth and making responsible choices with wealth. But then this has already been tried a few times in the Black and African American community. We mentioned the Tulsa Race Massacre and Black Wall Street, but there's also the practice of redlining that we've heard about. I'm interested if you've written anything or what your views are on redlining, and once again, how we have government infringement on helping people create, establish, and generate their own wealth.
Yeah, so redlining was, as you know, it was a way to maintain Black people as a second-class citizen, because having the ability to take loans from banks to purchase a mortgage was a way to start acquiring wealth. So by implementing the redlining policies, it made it harder for people of color, specifically Black people, to be able to have access to loans, not just for mortgages, but all type of credits.
Yeah.
Because we have an economy that runs on credit. So the worse is your credit, the more difficult it becomes for you to have access to other resources, because they're saying that you're not someone viable that we can rely on to pay back the loans we want to give you. So redlining was a government plot, in my opinion, that was well designed to maintain a group of people into poverty. That's what it comes down to.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
Well, so I'm finding myself, and today is really especially a day of listening for me. And I usually am more of a facilitative conversationalist, and I'm listening going, oh yes. And I'm finding myself just nodding along, and A, listening, and B, redlining is another thing I didn't learn about until pretty recently in my life. And I got there from listening to, subject matter experts like yourself talk about it. And me not being familiar with the process or the practice and how it existed as another policy, another law, another barrier introduced by the state to really keep those freedoms at bay. And so I'm struggling to do more than listen at this point, because everything you're saying is just truth bomb after truth bomb, and I'm nodding along. So I'm finding myself just listening, and I love it. I love so much of what you're saying and doing, because it highlights the barriers, and it highlights that there still are practices. Because have we overcome redlining, Germinal?
Well, one way to overcome redlining policies is for the community as an entity to start trading with each other, and that has been unfortunately one of the downfall of the Black communities, that we were not able to keep the money within the community. This is something, for instance, that the Jewish people have done very well. Jewish people have been ostracized for so long, God knows how long. It's even one of the reasons why you've never seen Jewish people in agriculture is because they had policies against Jewish people getting into agriculture. That's why Jewish people always had positions such as managers in various industries. And that's why they're into management positions throughout their existence rather than being farmers. Is because laws were implemented to prevent them from owning lands, and that did not discourage them. Instead, they say, you know what, we're going to gather and trade with each other. So whenever a Jewish person starts a business within the community, everyone comes and buy the product or the service of that business. And so the money stays for a long time until it leaves the community after. But in the Black community, unfortunately, we were not able to do that. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have to work on, is to learn. We always promote Black businesses, but it's one thing to promote it, and it's another thing to work on it. We always promote it, but people don't work on it. We're not united as a group and trading with each other yet. So it's something we have to work on.
So, Germinal, you bring up a great point, and I don't want to detract from our future Liberty Lunch, because we're going to dig into so much more. But talking today about Juneteenth, we were talking a lot about laws and policies and how they impact your community. And that's definitely one of the areas. And we're going to hear that next from Jeremy Thompson. He's going to be talking to us about how some laws and policies are really impacting his community. Again, Germinal, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving us just a tip of the iceberg of your financial literacy. It's so important. It's such an important narrative, and we're happy to be allies and amplify the message. Thank you, everybody. If you want to hear more and follow along and see when we're going to have Germinal on, please subscribe to our newsletter down at the bottom. Germinal, I don't want to take away from your Liberty Lunch, because I know you've got so much more to say. So thank you so much, Germinal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And so we mentioned previously about Jeremy, and you heard Jeremy's amazing poem earlier. Jeremy, though, the reason we reached out to you originally was admittedly not about your poem. We were looking for liberty in action and liberty in an individual and independent community, where we were seeing, laws and policies and practices impacting people. And we heard over and over again, hey, have you heard of Jeremy Thompson? Have you heard of the work he's doing? So Jeremy, let us know, what's the work you're doing up there in Boston with Liberty?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It actually is very similar to Germinal's, at least in my own projects, right? Like circa 2019, I started up a company called Little Liberty, and it is dedicated to poverty and trauma-informed financial consulting, to help those who are the most vulnerable in our society attain financial freedom within their lifetime. And so what I do through that is really just teach financial literacy through focus groups, and have other folks who are in those focus groups go out into the community and teach other people. I also offer individual services and pro bono services on the side for folks who are looking for disability advocacy, or advocacy on things that they don't really have, like for folks who really don't have an income, advocating for them on that end. So I really liked a lot of what Journal said. That was really awesome. And a lot of the other stuff I do is just general activism stuff, advocating for the unhoused and addicted populace out here who are constantly abused by the state.
Yeah. Sorry, Jeremy, I would love for you to share your work with what's called Methadone Mile with our audience.
Yeah, definitely. So methadone mile is an issue that was created by the state of Massachusetts and the city of Boston for about 30 years now, right? Boston has this constant. All right, so just talk about where it started. The origins of it started actually as an epicenter of the drug war. Crack was introduced into various communities by a government organization, which has been confirmed, and it has been disseminated. And now we're looking at the effects of that as there were laws against folks using and folks selling. And how that contributes is now that we have a lot of folks who are like either released from prison or who have been on substances for so long that they're incoherent, or folks just cannot retransition into life. And it's very hard. And then what's interesting is that we have the state pooling resources around the area, but none of them go anywhere. We have resources getting pulled into engagement centers that don't do anything for people, but it really just funnels into shelters. Shelters are overflowing, especially because of lockdowns. If you look at if anyone did any economical analysis as to what's going on down here, you could really just see how a lot of these government programs were created to migrate people into certain spaces and to overburden certain services the city has.
So, Jeremy, would you say that the government involvement in the community has helped or hurt?
Absolutely hurt. Hurt. Because when we look at some of the programs that have been developed, we're looking at funding going down to more than 50 nonprofits within a 2.5 mile radius. And we're not talking small money. We're talking like millions of dollars getting pulled into this. And we're looking at hospitals get funding to help address a lot of what's going down there. But again, like I said earlier, folks are just coming to these hospitals for a soda and sandwich. Why are they having CAT scans, MRIs, and STI testing being done on them when they can't even really consent to really anything in the first place?
The overreach there is just so sad. And Jeremy, I mean, I'll ask the question. You've walked the walk. You are there in action. Your boots have been on the ground in Boston. When we took our call with you, you were apologizing as you were out in the local community. And as you're out in the local community, Jeremy, do you think this situation and Methadone Mile is impacting any certain communities?
Absolutely. I would say it's specifically impacting like the Black and brown community more than anything. In Boston, Black and brown schools are being overburdened with bloody needles from folks who are using from the over-centralization of services the city provides. Bloody needles are found and killed in children's parks. People who are having sex openly in children's playgrounds in the back of their schools are often found. People are crapping on people's side, like literally pooping on people's front lawns, front porches. There's oftentimes just like random pools of blood that we find in places. The city officials, they just kind of just move the drugs. Or there was one instance where we had an EMT put some drugs down a drain. I think it was heroin he had kicked down a drain. And then we had literally right after, the news only showed him kicking it down the drain, but it didn't show the after effect where we had many unhoused and addicted people running for those drugs straight to the sewer. We're trying to open up the grate so that they could access the heroin. We have a bad batch floating around where people are ODing constantly. People are having liver spots. We're seeing people who are having like these open skin sores walking around. And it's a real issue, but we've been down there consistently helping feed and clothe folks and advocating politically for them by shutting down the highway whenever possible, really like demanding, government officials to show up and to have a conversation with us about this issue. And we've made it honestly one of the top 3 political issues in Boston. But at the same time, it's still, where are you? Like whenever we're outside, we're screaming like, Kim Janey, where are you? Michelle Wu, where are you? Charlie Baker, where are you? Andrea Campbell, where are you? Because all of you like to use pretty words, but we don't see those pretty words ever get put into action. Nor do we ever see anyone advocating for liberty when liberty is needed most.
So, Jeremy, something that I know is huge in Liberty community is private charity and volunteerism. And a lot of what you do personally and discuss here and what your work is about is private volunteerism and getting out into the communities. I mean, we're talking about the war on drugs, and we're talking about laws and legal regulations that are just being so hardlined and are so impactful to the community. And what I would say, based on what I'm hearing here and the data and facts in other communities, is negative and not working. I know Oregon actually just legalized all drugs and is aiming to focus on things like rehabilitation centers and treatment options instead of incarceration. Is this a conversation you've had or are hearing?
Absolutely. It is one that I am constantly trying to bring to the forefront, because criminalization of any activity is not going to help. If you criminalize the drug dealers for dealing, all that's going to happen, if you know anything about economics, you're going to just create a black market for these people to go deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole and find other ways to do what they're doing anyway. So the problem isn't the drug dealers. The problem is the state. The problem is that the fact that we're criminalizing addiction. The problem is this idea that we can just close down all of our rehab centers just to sell to different various developers around the city because the Democrats have like political favors they got to honor. And it's honestly just hurting our community constantly. Right?
Well, if we're honoring political favors and instead of honoring our community, and it's baffling to me that, it's not baffling to me, let me be honest, but it's sad to me that our politicians are putting political favors before people. Politics shouldn't come before people. It's the other way around. People should be before politics. And
that's where I would challenge you, though.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Because politics was never intended to come before people. Or at least, people were never intended to come before politics in that sense. Politics, the political game, is honestly just a clout chasing game. Someone who's running for city council at large, Domingos De Rosa, he calls this thing politricking, right? Because you're not honest, you're disingenuous about everything you say, but the true solutions that we can have to our own issues, like libertarians mention all the time, is voluntarism. And I do hope that we can bring that to the forefront of the conversation nationally when we talk about liberty activism or what can we do in our communities, because there's so many places to get involved.
Well, Jeremy, we have a local Bostonian at People for Liberty, someone who spent, I'm not even sure how many years, I think his DNA is embedded into the system, and that's Dan Fishman, our executive director at People for Liberty. Dan has been a Bostonian. Sorry. No, that's okay, Dan. Sorry to call you out, but
no.
When I went to Boston, I've been focusing on getting out and seeing freedom and the birth of freedom and liberty in America. I told many people, and everyone said, "Oh, Boston's a great city." And Dan immediately sent me like a 9-page PowerPoint document of here's everything you need to see in Boston and all the people that are up there. He didn't really, guys. But
so, I want to say something about it though too. And this is not shocking. It's certainly not going to be shocking to Jeremy. It's probably not shocking to most sports fans. But Boston, in spite of being an enlightened city, is at times an unbelievably racist city, and it's shocking for and I'm talking about Greater Boston here, Harvard, Tufts, these great colleges, these great institutes of academic achievement, and there still is, you talked about the Band-Aid story. I had an experience that was just astonishing to me. I lived in Beverly, which is a suburb north of Boston, where we're checking out of the Market Basket, and Market Basket is sort of a New England phenomenon. Grocery store where you can save a lot of money. And so it's always packed in these incredibly long lines. We're standing in one of these long lines to check out, and there's an old guy in front of me, and then another person who's checking out with a big bag of groceries. They changed cashiers, and a young African-American boy come up and took over the cashier. The guy grumbles and gets out of line and goes to another line. And I'm just like, what happened? And afterwards, I'm like, do you know that guy? He's like, no, but Massachusetts. I'm like, damn. That's something that I'd never seen before. I didn't experience until I didn't understand it until I saw that part of it. And I mean, I still can't understand it, but I'm so thankful that what Jeremy's doing right now is in the city, because there is a logical leap that should be making. He talked about, he mentioned some of the people of color who are running for mayor right now in Boston. And, Boston is, we did a little research on this, the only major American city to never have elected anybody other than a white man as mayor, which is an astonishing thing. Never a woman, never a person of color. And considering that I believe, and you can tell me if I'm right on this, Jeremy, Boston is now a majority minority community. There are more people of color. Yeah. And so hopefully this will be it. But last time it should have been it. And you saw political gamesmanship step up so that there were enough candidates of color promoted by other people so that no candidate of color made it through to the top two for the runoff. They split the vote. And in my opinion, and talking to people, it was a very deliberate thing. And so, Jeremy, the stuff that you're doing right now is critical because you're building the community. You're making them aware. And so I just wanted to thank you for doing that, man.
I definitely appreciate it. Just to talk more about the type of racism we have in Massachusetts. We have that liberal racism,
right?
That racism, that northern racism that no one wants to talk about. Everyone says, well, because y'all don't have sundown towns, it's okay. Well, my high school experience wasn't okay. Within my sophomore year of high school, a dean shot a student, and that they forced all the students to kind of go through this whole thing where we had to write letters to the student who was shot. We constantly had police in and out of the building, news reporters all around, and it didn't make national attention, right? Why is that the case? When you see every other school shooting when it's an actual kid, make national news media, but a dean actually shooting a student doesn't make the news? Interesting. Well, at least doesn't make national news. Interesting. Then we can talk about, my junior year at high school. This is English high school, by the way. We talk about my junior year at high school, where, because we were a turnaround school, students were able to get specific attention from their teachers and work on their problem areas. With that, students ended up scoring extremely high in the MCAS because they had been doing so well in these classes and focusing on the areas where they needed their help the most. Literally, they were pulling students out of lunch class to focus on the areas that they needed help in. And so when these students ended up doing well in the MCAS, the state of Massachusetts said there's no way Black students can beat BLS on the MCAS. And there was an entire investigation run on my schools, and students' MCAS scores were wiped. And they told the students to retake that test because they didn't believe our scores, even though they ran a private investigation and found that we did nothing wrong. We were still told that we were not good enough.
So Jeremy,
by the state.
That story, with your experience, we're talking about Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, the day that we're supposed to be celebrating freedom. Would you argue that freedom is here, that we've won, or is there still more work to do?
I would say absolutely. There's way more work to do, right? There's always going to be more work to do. And honestly, we aren't. No one is free until all of us are free. Period. I'm a Malcolm X kid. I am a Huey Newton kid. A lot of people like to say, "Oh, I'm Marxist," but I really consider the Black Panthers to be libertarian socialists, and I feel like their work was really important to the world of liberty, right? Because when we talk about private community solutions to the problems we face, these folks were feeding folks in their community, helping educate youth in their community, and helping people get guns. There is no more libertarian organization than that, in my opinion. And so I'm trying to recreate, not recreate that in Boston, but I am trying to do something similar where we can, protect our unhoused and addicted populations, because there are folks in our community. Rapes across Massachusetts have gone up 256% across the state. Wow. And methadone mile is a huge contributor to that problem. And this is since 2019. So what I'm trying to help address in partnership with some folks I drew into the Libertarian Party of Boston is try to set up these things called sleeping stations, where we get community members legally armed, train them in de-escalation tactics, and we work to set up a sleeping station, like a permanent area where we could set up tents or beds for folks and at least watch over them so that they know they will be free from sexual harassment and assault.
Jeremy, sorry, I would love to hear more from you during the Liberty Lunch, where we can really dig into the work that you're doing at Methadone Mile and hear about the actions and activities that you and your volunteers are taking as independent individual citizens, and how communities outside of Boston can take some of these tactics for liberty and action in their areas, and how we can help amplify and share the message and action and activity that you're doing in Methadone Mile. I really hope that you would join us on a future Liberty Lunch. I think that
I'm
looking forward to it, man. That's awesome. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us for the broadcast. Look forward to our future broadcast, and you're a Liberty warrior, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. But I do also want to highlight the other groups that I am working with. Well, just one at least. Like the Southern Rockaway Partnership has been incredibly instrumental in helping me commit to this work. be it with helping me deliver food, being it with helping us get clothes together for folks, being it help to like advocate politically for folks. They organized the protest. We went down to the State House, and it was just a beautiful thing. They allowed me to be the voice of their movement, and hats off to them. I love those folks.
Well, and hats off to you for building alliances, because alliances is what will set us free. I appreciate it, man. Talk to you soon, Jeremy.
Talk to y'all soon.
So to that end, our next guest is Aaron Shafer, sometimes known as Armed Atlas. Aaron is a Second Amendment arms instructor, advocate, been around. And as you can imagine, Juneteenth is a busy day for him. So he was gracious enough to record this beforehand. So without further ado, let me introduce Aaron Shafer, or Armed Atlas. Where is it? There it is. So our next guest is Aaron Shafer, better known as Armed Atlas. Well, maybe not better known, depends on how you met him first, I guess. Let me start that again with a slightly better volume, and I apologize to everybody. Thank you guys for letting me know the volume was bad. 1 second. All right. Here is Aaron. And to lead into the other, because I've always said there is no First Amendment without the Second. And I think about the Fourth Amendment. And, you know, the Fourth Amendment is something that actually protects the Second. The idea that you can't be searched. All these things tie together, and a guy who's really good at having those conversations is Aaron Shafer. Aaron, welcome to our broadcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I appreciate everyone for the opportunity to talk.
Well, so tell us a little bit about yourself, a little background. Where are you physically located?
Yeah, actually, I'm located in the South. I'm located in East Texas. It's hot right now. It's 98 degrees today, and
I don't know how I didn't know that before. I grew up in Galveston.
Oh yeah.
So I am familiar with that heat and some fierce humidity.
Oh yeah, it's been rough. I don't know how we're surviving. The horses are probably dying right now, but I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to talk to the People for Liberty and just kind of talk about what we've been discussing in the program that I've been running called Costly Conversations, which has revolved around Second Amendment conversations, specifically directed towards the Black community and their involvement in the Second Amendment world, just getting into firearms, responsible firearms ownership, and things like that. Of course, you know, Costly Conversations, as the name suggests, covers a variety of things. Like we're not scared to tackle topics just because it might get you some looks. That said, honestly, at the core of it is the idea that men and women of this country and of the world should be and are free to make their own decisions, to choose how they will defend themselves, that maybe we don't need to rely on the police to show up at our beckoning call. As soon as something bad happens, we can defend ourselves via common sense, via situational awareness. And if, God forbid, you should need to, you can defend yourself with a firearm as protected under the Second Amendment.
You know, one of the quotes that stuck with me early on in my life, growing up in Galveston, was we had a police officer who came into my elementary school, and this is how times have changed, talking a little bit about firearm safety. And their goal was, what they were doing was teaching kids what to do if you do accidentally find a gun in your house, which I actually think is a critical lesson.
Absolutely.
Children should be taught that, and pretending that it's never going to happen doesn't help anybody. But one of the things he said when one of the kids asked, he said, you know, why do we need a gun in our house at all if they're police officers? And he said, well, sometimes the police are only minutes away. But what if you only have seconds?
Right.
You know, so your parents made a decision to have a gun in the house and to be safe with it, and they're trusting you as a kid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to tell you everything that they said, but it was an amazing lesson. But now, right, you can't even talk about guns in schools.
No,
right?
they'll consider you crazy. They'll put you on a list. I remember I actually, just kind of thinking about it, I was interested in firearms back when I was in high school, and my teacher was so concerned about me. I guess she thought I was
Right.
crazy or strange, and that's just the kind of society we live in. I mean, I went to high school years ago, but
Not
imagine
as
how
long
it
as
is
me, my
now.
friend.
No, I get
Yeah,
that.
not as long as me. I am class of '85, and
Woo.
I'm old enough that my dad had riflery as a class in his high school.
Wow.
So yeah,
Man, I would have loved to have that class. But quick shout out to a friend of my show. He goes by the EDC guy on YouTube and Instagram. Him and somebody he's working with have actually created a children's book designed to help children understand just the lesson that you talked about with the local sheriff who came to the school, what to do when you find a firearm in the home. So they've worked on this book. It's actually released, and I'm gonna actually have him on the show in the fall. So if folks want to look out for that, I'm excited to have him on the show. Of course, look him up, the EDC guy. That book is, I think, vital to children's education. Someone once said we should teach in school finance and firearms. Well, there we go for one of them. Firearms is essential. They're part of our society. They're not going away as much as people might like to think they are. They're not going away.
And in fact, it's just the opposite. By not teaching it, we increase the danger of having it around. I mean, the same people who are saying, absolutely, we have to be teaching kids about sex so that they're prepared because, let's face it, if you're a teenager, sex is going to find you.
Yeah, it's there.
Exactly. It's the same thing about teaching safety when we talk about firearms. So let's talk a little bit about the community that you're working with, the African-American community, and how there are sometimes different issues than the white population has in terms of dealing with firearms.
Yeah. The first issue that I generally run into when having a conversation with people from my community, the Black community, is the way they think, kind of what's in between their ears. When you get a firearm, you want to work on a few things, but the first thing you have to address is what's between your ears. And really, it's not any of the things that you would typically think of, except for they generally, this is generality, believe like, oh, why should I get a gun? Guns are for white folks. That's an old white man's thing. And that is not the case, especially considering last year, the demographic shifted tremendously. There was a huge influx of 5 million new firearms owners, and 40 to 60% of them were from the African-American population.
Wow.
So it's a huge number of folks. So really, if we're talking about people that we need to reach out to, people who have shifted their mindset, we're talking 40-year-old folks. I talked to a guy late last year in the winter. He turned 50 not that long ago, and he bought his first firearm because of some of the events that unfolded last year. He felt maybe now's the time. He waited 50 years to buy his first firearm.
Sure.
Him and his wife. Now, I don't have any problem with him choosing to do that. That's a great thing. I encourage it. But what took you so long? That's my question. What are the mindsets that have been baked into the community that have, I suppose, kind of put a lot of folks into the mindset like, let me leave white folks this to the white folks. Let me leave this alone. This isn't for us. This isn't for me. This is dangerous. This will get me killed. If I have this and the police show up, I'm gonna be in more danger. Things that are not true. That's a lie. And really, it's fear that has.
It's also true that in states where we don't have constitutional carry, where you have to do some registration in order to potentially do something, that if you are legitimately fearful of the police, you could be worried about telling them you've got a gun. I had this tragedy. I used to own guns, but then I lost them all in this terrible boating accident.
Yeah.
The police don't have to worry about me anymore.
Wow, that's terrible.
But that's true in a community where you have a legitimate fear of being monitored unjustly, then you might have a second thought about that. Now, I want to quickly, I took the liberty of making a smaller URL for you. So tinyurl.com/ Costly Conversations now goes to your YouTube channel. So everybody, I recommend going there, watching the videos, tinyurl.com/costly conversations, and then bookmark the page and subscribe when you get there so that you get notified when new videos come out. Tell me a little bit about some of the videos that you've put up there. What are some of the ones that people have been excited about?
You know what? I would say the most exciting conversation that I had was with a young lady. She goes by Rhonda Mary, and she's a contrarian. Like, if the government says jump, she's like, why? And I'm here for it. I'm here for
sure.
it. And you know what? Honestly, she brought up a lot of very valid points. She talked about her own situation and why she got into firearms. She's a 2A advocate and a social political commentator on YouTube and Instagram. And she brought up a lot of good points regarding why she got into 2A, specifically because of a road rage incident, and a police officer who looked just like her, a black woman, said, "Hey, where's your firearm? Why didn't you have one?" And when the police are asking you, why aren't you armed? And the police officer looks like you, that does something for you. That encourages you. It says like, hey, why am I not armed? Why haven't I had these conversations with people from my community, other friends and other family members to jump into it? So
right.
Yeah, Rhonda Mary, she's up on the screen. That was one of my more exciting conversations. Of course, they're all great. I love each one of them. Just getting to know these different individuals from the firearms community and just knowing their stories, figuring out what makes them tick.
So, one of the interesting things, this is our Juneteenth broadcast, and, the name Juneteenth comes from the fact that, a lot of people didn't know that slavery was over because of unreliable communication or unreliable communicators who might have kept that information themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And bearing that in mind, what's something that most people don't know or that they should know about their right to bear arms that people don't know?
You know what? That's a great question. Well, a lot of people, first of all, aren't aware of their state and local laws. And I would highly recommend, just to make sure that you're not going to run into any issues, should you choose to purchase a firearm. Is not as difficult as you think it is, but you should definitely go ahead and look up your state and local laws before you decide to purchase a firearm. I would also encourage everyone out there to actually go look for a Juneteenth celebration for National Range Day, rather. A friend of mine, Marshall Davis from My Sister's Keeper, former veteran and affiliate of USCCA, which is a concealed carry organization. She set up a National Range Day where anybody, not just Black folks, anyone can go to the range, wear black, and just a celebration for National Range Day. We're going to the range, we're learning how to shoot, and of course, there's going to be different events and different people celebrating and different individuals and trainers who are there ready to offer their services and, of course, just help you out. There's going to be different groups. It's going to be great.
You really hit up something. I had no idea National Range Day was the same day as Juneteenth. I'm really going to start plugging that because that's awesome. It's a great event. I'll tell you one of the things that I was surprised to learn, and you can tell me about this, is that if you want to buy a shotgun, that's actually pretty easy to do.
Oh, so easy.
Right. And so people who think, oh, I can't go out and get a gun because I'm really worried about it, chances are pretty good you could go out and buy a shotgun and bring it home that day.
Yeah, likely same day. And if you're at all concerned about government regulations and all the different things that come with it and the changes to the law and who's the president and who's making noise, shotguns are generally exempt. Shotguns and hunting type weapons. And that's actually something me and Rhonda talk about is, it's interesting how, the AR-15 is on the chopping block and different pistols are on the chopping block, but yet the hunting type weapons like shotguns and hunting bolt action rifles have generally never been in the conversation, even in the strictest gun states like California. I'd highly recommend, at least if you're going to start, go ahead and get a shotgun. You don't have to get anything crazy expensive. And the ammunition at this point in time is dirt cheap and readily available.
Certainly compared to everything else, it's pretty cheap right now.
I mean, yeah, compared.
So let's do a little bit of gun safety too while we're here. I'll go through some of the things that I learned in my class. One of the most important things that people don't know is that when you're shooting, you should always be aware of what is behind the target that you're shooting at. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And when I think about that, I think specifically or especially in regards to hunting, knowing your target and what's beyond it. But also just in a self-defense situation, you need to know about that. And even when you're just at the shooting range, because God forbid you get ready to start, practicing or training, and there's somebody who is going up to the targets to, just pick one down or put one up. You need to know your surroundings. You need to know what's in front of you. You need to know your target and what's behind the target, or you could have a very unfortunate situation. That is one of the fundamental rules of firearm safety. And there's 3 more, including, keeping your finger off the trigger. I believe that rule alone will save you from a world of heartache and grief and pain. But also, I would say the most important rule, it is what it is to keep the firearm pointed in a safe direction at all times. I've seen a firearm go off because somebody got a little careless, something got jammed, somebody was cleaning, and the firearm went off, but it went off because their finger was on the trigger. But thank God it was pointed in the right direction, because if it was not, you could have a serious situation.
Right. One of my earliest instructors said, there's a whole bunch of different safeties involved, but the most important safety is the one between your ears. And
right here.
Yep, that's it. Well, Aaron, I really appreciate you coming on. Like we said, Armed Atlas Costly Conversations. You can find that at tinyurl.com/costly conversations. Anything else you'd like to mention? We learned that Juneteenth is also National Range Day. And so ranges are all over the place. I just did a quick search for it on Google, and you'll find a bunch of places that you can go and fire right now. And it's not just for African Americans. Anybody who wants to show up to National Range Day will be welcome. And, that's a great community to be in. The idea that, we form all these different communities. I can tell you that I have communities of friends who like firearms that are as tight as any other community that I've ever been in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm excited to see all the new and sprouting communities that have decided that they want to be involved in firearms, including Black communities that say like, hey, we want to get armed, we want to get trained, because training is the biggest thing. If you're going to buy a firearm, go get you some training. Like it's not that expensive, and even if it is, it's worth it. Your safety, your well-being, and understanding how to use it effectively, it could save your life. God forbid, but it could save your life. That said, I've been seeing quite a few members of the LGBT community deciding to take up their rights and to participate in the Second Amendment, which is huge. I think statistically that community is half as likely to be involved. So I think that's huge.
There's a great liberty story, a famous libertarian named Tom Palmer, who, was out and gay pretty early on. And his mother, who, really loved him because she was his son, bought him a 38 and said, listen, where you are, the lifestyle that you're living right now, this is, in the early 80s. She's like, I just want you to be safe. He's like, Mom, I'm not a gun guy. She's like, I want you to go get trained and learn how to use this and just carry it with you. And then one day, sure enough, he was chased to the end of an alley by a group of 4 guys who intended to do him harm.
Yeah.
And he had a 38 and they left. Yeah. And it's one of those things that absolutely you're right. Communities at risk. And nowadays, I think most people can point to themselves and say, in one way or another, I'm doing something that's at risk, but traditionally at risk communities, African Americans, Hispanics, LGBT, everybody should get the education. You know what? Even if you don't want to buy a firearm, you can still get the education without it. And so that you'll know.
Yeah, yeah, and there's wonderful national firearms directories at the end of in the links for each one of my videos. I have a link to firearms directories where you can find instructors, and you can also find specifically Black instructors if that's something you want to patronize, if that's something you want to experience. I think that's awesome to support. Just a great community of instructors who are passionate, who really want to put out awesome products for the people, and I'm just excited to be part of this. I'm excited to be talking to you, Dan, and I'm excited that we can have these crazy conversations that people don't want to have. But at the end of the day, it's going to point us towards freedom, whether that be with the Libertarian Party or something else that they choose. It's just pointing them towards liberty, and I'm excited about that.
I appreciate it. I thank you for everything you do. My guest here is Aaron Shafer, sometimes known as Armed Atlas, tinyurl.com/costly conversations. Aaron, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Dan.
I'm muted, but now I'm back. It's
Dan, I really do think Dan, I'm muted should be
the title of my autobiography. Yes,
absolutely.
So there were a lot of good points there, and actually, Aaron just texted me too, and he said, Dan, the number one thing is treat every gun. Number one safety thing is treat every gun as if it's loaded. So it's very important that we get that in. tinyurl.com/costly conversations to see his video channel. What did you take out of that, Holly?
So much. I'm in Virginia, and we have an organization, Black Lives Matter 757, and they had Black Guns Matter, where they actually lobbied and went to the Capitol. And I think firearms and firearm safety and education and use and ownership, so important in the Black and African American community, and something that we've seen a huge uptick in. We have seen it increase dramatically for either their own comfort or their own protection, and this notion that it is a right and they can have firearms, and really breaking down this barrier and narrative that's been established that firearms are only for a certain group of individuals. I love it. I think the entire conversation is a good one, a necessary one, and I love seeing more of it.
That's awesome. Let me bring back in our founder, Lauren Postler. Lauren, we've had a lot of great liberty conversations, tying things in. We saved arguably our most famous speaker for last.
Well, and I'll share that I have a special love for Larry Sharpe. I'm sure most people in the liberty movement are familiar with him, but Larry was one of those early believers in the People for Liberty movement in our organization. He was a guest on our Women's Empowerment live stream way back in August of last year. And he said, what you guys are doing, spreading the message of liberty, reaching people that are curious about the movement, and doing so as an independent organization that is nonpartisan outside of party, this is desperately needed. So Larry has been a tremendous champion of the liberty movement. I love conversation that he and I had about the difference between intent and impact. And I think that's a larger conversation we'll likely come back to, as it's relevant to so many of these conversations we're having. But Dan, you had the chance to catch up with him and talk about the libertarian take on reparations, which I think is fascinating, very timely for Juneteenth. And Larry, I'm looking forward to seeing you in Michigan, my friend. So thanks so much to Larry for taking time to pre-record with Dan. He's a special friend to People for Liberty, and we're thankful for his time.
Yeah, and let me get that tape up. And please, people, this is a share. If you can share this, because this is a new, radical, and amazing thought in the liberty movement. The thing that Larry has, he has this ability to resonate with people that is unique. And one of the reasons why he's going to be an outstanding guest for us here on our Juneteenth broadcast. So welcome to the show, Larry Sharpe. Larry, thanks so much for being here.
Dan, so glad to see you. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. It's it's important to me, I as a guy who grew up in Galveston, to talk about Juneteenth, because I think still it's not a broadly understood or well-known holiday. And so just for the people who don't know, Juneteenth is celebrated as the day that slavery was officially ended. And the reason they call it Juneteenth is because in the old days, communication wasn't instant. I mean, millennials can't understand it, but nobody was able to make a Facebook post saying slavery is over. So the message took a while to travel. And there's, of course, stories of unreliable narrators. There are some people who are benefiting from slavery who never bothered to tell their slaves, oh, slavery is over, by the way. All these things that you would expect. And we celebrate Juneteenth as a day of liberation, something that's important to the Libertarian Party. And there's a lot of issues around that. And Larry, you wrote a piece about a libertarian plan for reparations, which I think is everybody should read it. They can find it at your site, I think sharpeway.com. And going there, let's talk first about what reparations means to different people, because I think that's an important first part of this topic.
Yeah, let me, if I could, thank you for that. Let me, if I could, kind of preface it with two different pieces, if I could.
Yeah.
The first piece is what we seem to have dealt with, or what seems to be happening right now in America. And that is the idea of the left usually saying racism is systemic and then blaming the individual. That doesn't work, right? It's either systemic or it's the individual, right? Systemic means that it doesn't matter who the individual is, the system creates the racist outcomes. If that's true, then it doesn't matter if the person's black or white or whatever they are, the system pushes them to that, right? The reason why you'll find very often people who shoot cops who attack or hurt or kill black people sometimes are also black or Hispanic or whatever, right? It isn't only white cops who do that. Right. So that's the type of systemic thing we're talking about, right? That's a system. So it doesn't make sense to me to go white guy bad. That doesn't make any sense because it's systemic.
Right. Right.
So that's piece one. But when we do that, and now the left goes, oh, see, you're bad. Now I've lost my allies. I want allies. If the system is bad, and I say it is, then I need allies to change the system. So why would I alienate people when I need them to change the system?
Right. And I just have to put on top of that, I think anybody who doesn't think that this current system is broken isn't paying attention, because the numbers are overwhelming. There are very different outcomes in the legal system based on your color. There are very different outcomes before you get to the legal system, whether or not you are stopped by a police officer in the first place, based on what you look like. And so I think that I hope that most of the United States is past the idea that there is not systemic racism, because clearly there is.
No. There's a huge chunk of America who does not believe it at all. Wow. And the reason why they won't hear it is because we say systemic, but then blame the individual. What I say, and there's certain phrases we use when it comes to systemic racism. We say things like white supremacy or white privilege. Now, why would I use those phrases? If you and I, Dan, are in we're PhDs and we're in some ivory tower having intellectual conversation, fine, let's use those phrases. Who cares? We know the definition, what they're supposed to be. We get it. No worries. We can have that conversation. But once you bring that into the mainstream, what does every white person think when they hear white supremacy? Oh, I'm a racist? What does every white person who's not wealthy hear when we say white privilege? Wait a minute, I'm not privileged. So we're just alienating people. Now, if you went to the average person, white person or not, and said, can we talk about the criminal justice system? I think there are some black disadvantages. 90% of Americans would go, yeah. 90% would.
Right.
But if you instead said, I think there's some white privilege, a bunch of Americans go, no, there's not. My brother was in jail. I was in jail. I got arrested for meth. They don't believe you. They don't hear you. The phrase itself is insanely dumb and not required. It makes no sense whatsoever. So we shouldn't be using those phrases. They are alienating phrases, right? So that's the first piece.
Yeah. And well, and especially, that idea of, when there is a message in there, and, you taught me something here. I never thought about the idea that saying white privilege, as opposed to just privilege, is going to take some people and look at it and they're going to say, well, why are you calling me out for it? I mean, there is, I think that there is a truth that, if you're white and you're in a car, you're less likely to get stopped, but that's a privilege. It's not your fault that you were white at that point in time.
So let me go back to that exact point. If we're going to say white privilege, if we're going to say that, which again, I'd rather say a disadvantage, but fine, we're going to go there. If there is some privilege given to white people, it is the system that gives the privilege.
Right.
The individual white person doesn't wake up in the morning and go, oh, I'm a white guy. Let me use my privilege today. No one does that. That's a fantasy. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
But if there is a system that does that, then again, let's stop blaming white people and let's instead fix the system. I go back to the same thing. So again, I wouldn't use white privilege or white supremacy. I wouldn't use those phrases. I think they're bad, divisive phrases. But if you want to use them, I can't stop you. At least think, okay, so it's the system that provides this supremacy or provides this privilege. So how about instead I stop saying, hey, white guy, don't be white. Or, hey, white guy, you're bad for being white. Right. How about I might say, hey, white guy, you're getting some advantage or something because this system's broken. Can you please help me fix this system? The problem we have right now, particularly with it's the right has a different problem. I'm staying on the left for a little bit. I'll go to the right in a second. On the left side, you have people who are saying, well, if you say you're not racist, then that also means you're kind of racist because everybody's racist. This goes back to the next piece. When the average person hears the word racist or racism, they still think of a guy with a hood trying to kill a black guy or a guy with an armband trying to, put a Jewish person in a camp. They still see that's the connotative meaning of that. Right. So when you say that, of course, the average person goes, I'm not racist. Why would you say that? Stop doing that. So when you say that, they get mad. Now, who isn't mad when you call them a racist? An actual racist.
Exactly.
Yes. They're like, yeah, I'm in. Yep. Hate those other people, whichever ones I'm racist against. I hate those people. So yeah.
I am defending my race.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So when you call someone racist and they say, I'm not racist, we get angry at them when we should be like, I'm glad this person is unhappy being called a racist. Maybe they think racism is bad. But we're now punishing them for that instead of going, good. Oh, good. Okay, you don't like being a racist. That's wonderful because you're not one. So I think that's another issue we're dealing with. That's the left. The right has the backlash problem. The right is so angry and feels so attacked and alienated that they have decided that there is no problem. They've decided there's no problem. There's no such thing as systematic racism. Nothing's racist. And they find answers and everything they can to deny that it even exists. And I don't blame the left for what they're doing. I don't blame the right for what they're doing. They're both wrong. Right. The reality of it is there is a systemic issue. It's not the individual. We should all band together to fix the system. And the reason why I talk about Juneteenth so often, and I talk about the systems, is every time you see huge racial disparity, huge racial aggression, violence, it is every single time government sponsored. Every time. It's not individual sponsored. The individual American actually doesn't care about race at all. The individual American gets up every day and goes, I got my own stuff to deal with. I'm going to go deal with my stuff. That's what the average American does. I want to go deal with my stuff. And then race comes in. Of course, but they don't care about it. How do I know it to be true? Again, look at the laws in the South. They had to have segregation laws because they didn't have laws. We would have integrated.
Right. And, it's one of my favorite examples, and people don't realize that Rosa Parks being on the back of the bus was actually the legal split that was required by the town of Montgomery.
That's correct.
You look, where there's a lot of talk right now about Tulsa and Rosewood. In both of those cases, the government is heavily involved in what's going on.
Oh, hold on. Let me touch the Tulsa. Yeah. Look at those pictures of the black men walking.
Yeah.
What's next to them? U.S. Army soldiers.
Yep.
They are being walked away as prisoners. What people don't understand about Tulsa is the side is one or the other. Well, it's, some black guy was raping women, so they had to take care of him, and that's got out of hand. That's side one. Other side is, well, white people are evil and got mad and decided they were jealous, so they burned down Tulsa. Let me tell you what actually happened over all of that, regardless of how that happened. The Black Wall Street was filled. It was 1920, 21, right? Filled with World War I veterans.
Yep.
Black World War I veterans who had fought in France. Yep. So they all were armed and knew how to fight. So what had to happen? No sheriff's going to walk into that. That sheriff would have been shot dead. There's no way that was going to happen. No individual guy's going to walk in there. He'd have been shot dead. Nope, not happened. What actually happened was the government created a bunch of deputies by giving them government-sponsored weapons and weapons from the army, and used army veterans, white army veterans, to go in there and disarm everyone.
Right.
Then the army came in and marched those men out.
Yep.
Then they could burn Wall Street. They couldn't burn Wall Street without it. So government had to sponsor it. The individual average white guy wasn't like, no, I should do today. And they go burn down Black Wall Street. That doesn't happen. That's never happened. It's always government sponsored.
And so putting that, I mean, I think there we've sort of set the table perfectly to talk about the idea that if you have this level of systemic racism, there has to be a level of systemic reparations.
Yes.
But go ahead. You go.
Let me walk down that reparations piece now.
Yep.
With almost all other reparations, there's been a proximity to the event. So the people who were paying the price, it was kind of, if not exactly, at least close to the people who did the deed or responsible. And that's been common in most cases, some exceptions, but in most cases, that's been true. The example I'll give is we talked before about Jewish reparations. The German government paid Jewish survivors for years. I think there may be still some survivors who are being paid, but I'm unsure. But the German government paid. Well, the German government started paying in the 40s. Well, yeah, they probably should have. It was those people who did it. So yes, they should pay. Makes total sense, right? And most people were okay with that. Made sense. Let's do it. So that happened. When it came to Americans, Black Americans, there was an actual plan to make that happen. The 40 acres and a mule. Maybe you've heard about that. What was supposed to happen in 1865, which was put forward, I think, by Sherman and or Grant. I've forgotten which one. I think it was Sherman who put it forward. It was the idea of, let's take the land of the wealthy landowners who own slaves. So people who benefit from slavery, they pay. Makes total sense. The poor white guy in the South who didn't own slaves doesn't pay that price. Makes sense. Like that idea. Take their land. They're the ones who did it. Perfect. And the army now literally has millions of mules it's using to pull the wounded, pull ammunition, pull supplies. When the war's over, we don't need them. Why don't we give these mules so that we don't have to either kill them or feed them, give them to the former slaves? We'll give them 40 acres and a mule.
Yep. That makes complete sense to me.
Makes total sense. Love the idea. That'd have been great. So, of course, former slaves heard this and started going back to the land and cutting it up and doing it. Then Lincoln gets shot. Then Andrew Johnson shows up and goes, oh, no, we're not doing that. So he sends the army in to forcibly remove the slaves.
Wow.
So government comes in, removes the slaves. And Johnson, by the way, gave the slave owners reparations for losing their slaves. Yes. Right. People say, well, why didn't they give other people? They did. Literally, the slave owners got reparations for losing their slaves because that was property in Andrew Johnson's mind. So they got reparations. The slaves didn't. So you might say, well, wow, that's terrible. It is. And they were forced to become sharecroppers or leave or died or were killed by the government, all those things. So now so reparation doesn't happen then. So now what do Black people do? Well, let's try to survive in our own anyway. We're not segregation. Well, first, Black people try to get into the government, right? They try to get in the government. That gets cut out. Now they can't vote. Now they're segregated. So what do? They create their own systems, right? So they create their Wall Streets. There were many Wall Streets throughout the country. They create their own. So they go, okay, we'll do it ourselves. And then in each case, the government sees it, and then government sponsored begins to burn and destroy them systematically.
Right.
So no reparations. And then when they try to get in the government, pushed out of government. And then when they try to build their own, gets destroyed. So now, after every war, the Black soldiers who thought, I fought for this country, so I get something. After the Civil War, nope. After World War I, nope. Black Wall Streets, KKK is as powerful as it ever was after World War I, right? Again, got to shoot them down. After World War II, we think, okay, now they got to give it to us now. We fought in 3 wars. Come on. Now they're going to give us something, right? No, because now the government comes down and says all these mortgages, all these government-backed loans can be in all these neighborhoods except Black. If you were Jewish, if you were Irish, if you were Italian, you could be in. They didn't like you guys either, but they would take some of you. And they literally had guidelines. It was 30%. It could be 30% of the neighborhood. It could be Jewish or Italian or Irish. So the Irish and Italians and Jews, they got their little area they could be in a little bit. We're okay with some of you. That's it. But Black people, 0. So now again, we want our piece of the pie. We can't get it. We can't get our piece of the pie again. We're redlined out. We can't get mortgages, all these things.
Yeah.
And then people say, well, okay, so, but you got civil rights. Well, we fought for civil rights then, right? So we get the Civil Rights Act. Okay, we get that. We went back to government because trying on our own didn't work. So we said, okay, we're going to try government. So we got the Civil Rights Act. Yeah, but wait a minute. But what does the Civil Rights Act give us? War on poverty, war on drugs.
Right.
War on poverty, war on drugs.
Victims. Yep.
Yes. So as we thought we were getting equal, now we get made victims. Even if we don't want to be victims, we get made victims.
Yep. And I just want to, you talked about redlining. People who aren't familiar with that, look it up. It's a separate show on itself, but it's an unbelievable part of systemic racism that people should be aware of. So look up redlining. That's your homework. Keep going.
And I want to be clear. People get mad and go, well, you're saying we're racist. No. Do I think the average broker said, ooh, I don't want to put a black family in this house? No, I think the average broker wanted to make money.
Right.
And probably would have put a black family in the house. But when literally the black family can't get a loan to get in the house, or if a black family goes into that neighborhood, all of them can't get loans because of government regulations and rules. You've just made the non-racist broker a racist because of the system. You've made them racist, and they weren't racist. They were just some guy or some gal trying to make money. And all of a sudden now they have to act in a racial manner. You keep doing that for decades and people start acting accordingly. Well, now the war on drugs comes. So the war on drugs now says, okay, we got to start, literally beating up black people. And for some reason, Nixon didn't like Puerto Ricans. I don't know why specifically, but Nixon did not like Puerto Ricans. I don't know why. Puerto Ricans are wonderful people. I love them, but whatever. That's his thing. That's his kink, whatever. He doesn't like Puerto Ricans. He didn't say like Mexicans or Hispanics. He was specific on Puerto Ricans for some reason. Anyway, so Nixon wants to beat up black people, Puerto Ricans, and the liberals, whoever he thought they were.
Right.
So war on drugs. War on drugs comes through, and the problem is you got to pay for it. You got to validate it.
Yep.
Well, how do you pay for it? How do you validate it? Well, grabbing people's stuff.
Yep.
How do you do that? Poor neighborhoods.
Asset forfeiture.
Asset forfeiture, poor neighborhoods. Yep. And what made it worse? Now you think, well, things are getting better because we've got, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air on TV, and we've got Cosby before he was rapist. They got him on TV, right? We go, we're doing fine. Here comes Clinton, and now our President Joe Biden in Senate. Crime bill. These are evil. We're going to put 100,000 cops into black neighborhoods. So let me ask you a question, people. This is the argument from the right. The right says, well, if they wouldn't get in trouble, they wouldn't be in front of cops. They wouldn't be getting arrested. That's an accurate statement. But if I put 100,000 cops into your neighborhood, then you would be accosted by cops because I put 100,000 cops in. Yet again, the government system puts 100,000 cops into black neighborhoods. Yeah. It wasn't like the cops wanted to go to black neighborhoods. They didn't, well, most cops obviously don't get up and go, you know what I did today? We have some black people. They don't do that. They don't care. That's their job. Well, if the government puts you in black neighborhoods, what are you going to do? You're going to hunt in black neighborhoods. Right. And then the government says, I'm only going to pay for those cops for 2 years. After that, fine. Most people don't know this. The federal government only paid for those cops for 2 years. After that, there was no more money. So what do you got to do? Civil asset forfeiture goes into overdrive.
Right. When a policeman has a financial incentive to confiscate property to maintain his job, his or her job, it's very much a, everybody can look at it. If you can't look at
literally systemic.
Yep, exactly.
But now people say, well, Larry, you don't get it. So your redlining thing doesn't work because your redlining thing, we ended that in like the 70s or something. And by the 80s, it was over. Well, that's theoretically accurate. However, when people and bankers and mortgage brokers are looking for people with good credit, they're looking for good credit. Of course they are. So what happens? Well, can black families have good credit? Not a history because they were denied
before. Yep.
For decades. So now we're all climbing up a ladder and we're going, well, now I've removed the handcuffs. Yeah, but I'm at the bottom of the ladder still. You guys are at the halfway point.
Right.
So even if we go up the same, I'm still behind you. That's a problem there. Right. I got to get there. Now add that plus the war on drugs. What does the war on drugs do? It removes the father from the home. What does the war on poverty do? It increases and helps the father not being home. It makes sense for the woman to not be working and the father not be at home. Right. Yet again, a system.
Right.
That's what began to happen.
And just to be clear for the people who may not know that, part of the war on poverty was that if there was not a father in the household, a woman would get more money from the government.
Yep.
And so in many cases, and very much racially targeted,
Yes.
In many cases, that meant that Black families chose to not have a father in the household so that there would be more money. It's it was a very deliberate attack.
Absolutely. So am I calling the average banker or mortgage broker racist? Again, no, I'm not calling the individual American a racist. I'm calling the system. Did the banker actually care who they gave the money to? No. All the banker did was look at who had the best credit, the best chance for them to make money. That person consistently was a non-Black person because that person didn't have a credit history.
Right.
That's the reason. So it wasn't like it was a racist banker. He just looked at the numbers and said, there's the numbers. I'm going to pick who I'm going to pick with the numbers. That's systemic. That's what I mean.
And so here now we go. Your argument is flawless. There has been systemic racism. And in many ways, we are the first generation to really talk about doing something about it.
Yes.
And so there is, but you also point out that you can't blame the individuals. It has to be a thing with the system. So how do we have a system of reparations, of trying to right the wrongs that were done in the past that doesn't hurt the people who are currently? I'm laying it out for you. What do you got for me?
The biggest issue that the Black community deals with in general, there are many of them, but here are two big issues. One, generational wealth, and two, an ownership mindset. Those two things are critical for the Black population to grow. Killer Mike said it. He was like, he did one of his shows where he was talking about, trying to survive in a Black only environment, right? Trying purposely to only go to Black owned businesses in Atlanta, which is a heavily Black city. Couldn't do it. And it made him actually say something, which was very controversial, but I get where he's going with it. He said, there was an advantage to segregation. At least there had to be Black owned businesses because you couldn't go to white ones. So there had to be a Black shoemaker. There had to be a Black diner. There had to be a Black lawyer because you couldn't go to white ones.
Right.
So, but that was his point. No ownership, right? And then that piece, and then no generational wealth. So here's my answer to deal with both of those things without having to punish people today, because the proximity is so far. The vast majority of Americans alive today never owned slaves, don't have family members who own slaves. The vast majority don't. I mean, maybe 2% of Americans could somehow link themselves back to a slave owner. And I'm probably being, that's probably too high. Maybe. Yeah. So then how do I do that? Here's how. I have three pieces to this. Piece number one, understanding generational wealth. Anytime a person who's a descendant of slaves, and we use a similar system we use now with Native Americans to figure out if someone's a descendant of slaves, you create a list. These are the people who are considered descendants of slaves. So new people from Nigeria don't get this. Right? It's only descendants of slaves. They get it. If they want to transfer wealth within their family, it is free, regardless of any laws or taxes or fees. In this case, it is free. They get to transfer wealth any way they want for specifically 23 years. I use 23 years because that's a generation. I'm okay to shift that up or down, but there should be a specific time, right? If you want to go hardcore, do 46 years, do 2 generations. I'm fine. We can find the number. The number, I'm okay with moving that number around, but we have a specific number. For the sake of argument, I'm saying 23 years. Again, that's movable.
Right.
So for 23 years, you can shift wealth any way you want for free. If there's a local law, I'd make this an amendment. It breaks the local law. Too bad. No, if you are a descendant of slave, you pay nothing. It is free. That's number one.
And that's a critical thing when we talk about understanding generational wealth, because right now, there are penalties for that and I don't want to say penalties that like hurt you, but that you pay a cost if you want to transfer wealth from one generation to another. And for the people who don't have a lot of generational wealth, it takes everything. For the people who have billions, well, that $1 million penalty isn't going to hurt them very much. So this allows people who haven't been able to build generational wealth in the past to at least build some.
Correct. And also something else. The Black community starts hearing about generational wealth, which a lot of people don't even think about. It's like not a thing. I want my people to think about that. This is a thing you should be considering and thinking about. That's the second piece. That's piece one. Piece two, getting that wealth. How do you get that wealth? Now, most people would say, well, you're going to give them a check, Larry. I'm going to say, no, I'm not a fan of writing checks as reparations. And people say, Larry, why not? Here's the reason why. The lottery. The lottery shows me that when people who win the lottery, after 5 years, over 50% are worse off than they were, and about a third go bankrupt.
Right.
Why in the world would I want to destroy my people? Why would I do that? Why in the world would I want to destroy my people by giving them all a bunch of use checks? Dave Chappelle did a show on this.
Oh my God, one of my favorite episodes. I was just going to mention it. I recommend
Yes.
everybody look it up. Find the Chappelle reparations sketch. You can look it up. It's a
Yes.
fantastic piece.
He knows what I'm talking about. I know it too, right? It's a bad idea. But then the answer in response to it, well, Larry, don't give them a lump sum. Instead, give them payments, right? How about over your 23 years, everyone gets X dollars per month, whatever, that kind of thing. I get that completely. And here's why I'm against that. You see it right now already. All the people getting structured settlements, who steps in? Bankers do. Oh, get your cash now. We'll give you one lump sum. Get your money now. And that's already happening now. So what winds up happening? At least half of my people decide to do that, get their money up front, and ruin themselves again. I don't want to do that. So I don't even want the idea of having the structured settlement. I'm not a fan of that. So I don't want that either. So how? Here's what I think we do. Any property purchased and then owned and purchased, or owned or purchased by 51% descendants of slaves gets half property tax for 23 years. Now, why would that matter? I mean, commercial, private, residential, I don't care if it's, rental income, whatever it is, any property purchased, half property tax. Again, this has to be it has to be like an amendment because it's got to go through anything, right? It's got to be like, doesn't matter. Half, period. Now, why does that matter? No, I didn't say bought by a descendant of slaves. 51% or more owned, which means now, say I'm a white guy, I'm an Asian guy, I'm a whatever I am, and I want to buy a big building. It's the first thing I start thinking of. Where are my black friends? It's the first thing I start thinking. Where are my black friends? Because I want them on board here. So what am I doing now? I am encouraging integration without demanding integration. I am encouraging people to work together without demanding it. Not just that, you're going to find a lot of black people who are going to come in who didn't know how this system worked, who didn't get it. Now I'm training them by default. They're training themselves. They're training themselves by default, how this works. You add the generational piece and now the property aspect, and now we're changing how the black community thinks. Now, many black people do think this way already.
Right.
Isn't like a lot don't, but those who are in trouble often don't. So those who are not in trouble, they get to have an advantage. Those who are in trouble get to step up. And that's what I'm trying to achieve. And they'll step up again voluntarily. Look, if you own your property and you don't care, then don't get your black friends involved. That's fine. Don't do that. No worries. You're not required to, but it's half.
Well, and so
now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there are examples of that exact model working. So I believe media companies, if it's either woman or minority, 51% owned, there is a tax break. And so you saw that happening. So we know that this is a model that is successful.
Correct. Absolutely. And it brought so many women into the workforce and into entrepreneurship because what women found in the 80s and 90s is the glass ceiling was stopping them.
Right.
So they began instead to go off and build their own. And now you have a situation in today's world where there are a lot of investors who won't invest in the company if there's not at least a woman in the C-suite, if not the top.
Right.
That's where we are now. That's been the swap. And that's been voluntary. So I'm totally fine with that. But it's the second piece. Business. Any business entity started, if it's 51% or more owned by descendants of slaves, half business tax for 23 years. Same thing. So I got a time limit and I got a massive change and an incentive for descendants of slaves to start gaining stuff, gaining property, gaining businesses, gaining intellectual property, gaining things, and then an incentive to transfer that wealth for free in 23 years. Now, there are two arguments I get from this often. Well, I'm sorry, there's a third piece of this, and that is immediately end the war on drugs. And anyone who has been, to include black people, but this is for anyone who has any type of non-violent, and I mean selling or possession charges, are all wiped, immediately expunged. Now, if you shot somebody, or that's different. But if you were just selling or possession all of them gone. Now, that will also help white people, Hispanic people. That'll help everybody. But by percentage, it'll help black people more.
Yep.
So now, all of a sudden, you're no longer a felon for anything you do that's nonviolent. You got a chance now to get out there. People are going to be literally knocking down your door going, hey, can you help me buy this property? Hey, can you help me start this business? Oh, by the way, generational wealth is a thing. And now that can happen. And now you get an actual second chance. That's what begins to happen. Now I get a couple people who push back. The first pushback I often get is, well, Larry, that's going to lower our tax base, so everybody has to pay more taxes. I disagree completely. And why do I disagree? For two reasons. One, the black population is less than 13% of the population anyway. Plus, it's just property tax and business tax anyway.
Right.
So actual percentage will be low compared to everything else. Plus, this should, if it's done right, and I think we can see it from previous, this should spur economic activity. Buying, selling, changing, shifting, all those types of things. In fact, even foreign companies might start doing that too to get some extra tax breaks in America. So it should start a massive shift and change and rotation. So that economic should pretty much even it out. So I think that's step one.
I think that one is a critical thing because there's a John Kennedy, right? Mr. Democrat said at one point in time that the easiest way to get things spurred in a certain community is to lower their taxes, and that the economic gain will be more. His phrase, rising tide lifts all boats. You make it possible, it works out for everybody else. You're not talking about a loss of revenue when this happens.
Absolutely true. And so that's the first thing I get. I get that fight pushback often. But also it's like, well, Larry, what after 23 years? Where's the best part? Do you think all those people are going to want to raise their taxes again? Of course not. Of course not.
Right.
So they're going to fight to retain the same tax level for everybody.
Yep.
And guess what? It's going to work. And when it works and we all get a tax break, what is America going to say? Thank you, black people, which is what I want you to say. So all of a sudden you go, thank you, black people. You gave us all a tax break. That's amazing. After 23 years, it changes that. But more importantly, it begins to change the mindset that you were talking about. It changes the mindset. It makes people think, oh, I should think more like an entrepreneur. That's how my parents got out of poverty in the South Bronx. That's how many immigrant communities get out of their bad situations. It's because of the entrepreneurial spirit. We create that spirit of ownership and entrepreneurship and ownership to move people to the next level that stays in the culture. It will then begin to break the culture, shift the culture, and we'll integrate on our own voluntarily. The last piece I'll bring up, if I could.
Yeah, please.
And I'll wrap up with this last piece.
No.
Is that what I want to do is have an actual solution, not just something that feels good. This is a solution. People say, but Larry, what about people who are older? What are they? Well, this gives you an incentive if you're younger to transfer your wealth to your grandma right away.
Right.
Transfer your wealth to grandma, grandpa right away. I can't fix the issue of the generations we've already lost. I can't change that. And some of the people who are older, I can't change that. What can I do? Make things better from now and in the future. Right. That I can do. I want this to be a thing where we can say, we've done it, reparations are paid, we are better off, let's move on together.
So you laid out a tremendous case that there is indeed systemic racism. You've proposed a solution that doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't take money away from anybody. It merely gives people an incentive to start businesses that will generate more money. It allows people to accumulate generational wealth at, okay, maybe we could say that's at the expense of the government and the estate tax, but honestly, if there's anybody who's out there actually defending the estate tax, you're not going to like anything else in this plan either.
That's true. Yes.
So it makes complete sense. So what is there?
And it doesn't blame anybody.
Exactly.
It doesn't blame anybody because the people today didn't do the bad stuff of 100 years ago.
Right. But it does actually acknowledge that bad things happen. And that's an important thing. Some people are so set in their mind, they're like, I don't want to even acknowledge that this bad thing happened. I'm going to pretend like it's not an issue, but it was. And anybody who's looking at it honestly would see this. So I love this plan. I want to know, what is the activism path? What's the call to action here? How do we get people to know more about it? Is the first thing to do to get more people to sign up at the Sharpe Way, find out more about the stuff that you're talking about?
I love that idea. Well, I love that idea.
Because I actually think that's the right thing for people to do, is that they should be seeing the stuff that you're putting out on these issues because it's on point, and sharing it widely. Because right now, that's the first step. We want more calls to action, but the first call to action is education.
100%. And what I'm trying to show is you can assign or take responsibility without assigning or taking blame. That's the critical things. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not blaming some white guy today for slavery. You didn't own any slaves. You didn't do anything. I'm not blaming you for that at all. I'm just saying, let's acknowledge it. Let's have some empathy and let's find an answer. That's all I'm saying. And if you can be like, you know what, Larry, you're right. That was pretty crappy what happened. I'm with you. Let's find an answer. I think we can win. So what do I want people to do? I want people to stop blaming and to just start having empathy. How do you do that? Number one piece, watch my show Sharpe Way.
Yeah.
Number one.
I can't argue with that. I think that it's a really important thing for people to be doing, because everybody should be consuming from we live in this amazing time where there is a broad and deep sea of content. People should be drinking deeply out of there. I guess drinking out of the sea isn't a good analogy. Deep lake of content. People should be drinking deeply out of it. See all the content that's out there. And I can tell you, as a guy who follows Larry regularly, he's talking about stuff that isn't normally talked about, laying things out like this, right? I mean, this was such a cognizant argument, so well laid out in order that it's not the sort of conversation that people have heard before about reparations. So please subscribe to Larry's channel. Go to the sharpeway.com, not the Sharpe Way, sharpeway.com, scrolling across the bottom. Find out more about the stuff that Larry's putting out, and then share this, because this reparations idea is one of the best one that's out there. It should appeal to people in the liberty movement because it ends up with lower taxes for everybody. So, I mean, how is this not a win-win scenario? It is. So that's awesome. Larry,
Thank you, my
I
friend.
need to do the thing that I was going to ask you to do, which was promote yourself, but it just kind of came upon me at that point in time.
So good.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being here for our Juneteenth broadcast. I hope that you're doing something awesome to celebrate, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, my friend.
I unmuted really early this time in the grand scheme of things. When Larry first laid that down, I read the paper, and he wrote the Libertarian Plan for Reparations about 4 months ago. I was just astonished at what a fully developed argument it was.
Yes.
It's just, I think, getting people to see that and understand it all the way through is a critical thing.
Well,
Go ahead.
Dan, if I can briefly share, I was discussing this with my parents yesterday, and I think having difficult conversations with friends and family is one of the challenges to us in the liberty movement, to have difficult conversations in thoughtful, meaningful, and respectful ways. And one of the things that came up was this, pervasive sentiment that I have heard from many in my network, that they feel attacked when people say systemic racism. So making the distinction that you, whoever you may be talking to, are not the system. We are not accusing you. That emphasis on distinction between the individual and the system. So grateful Larry was able to join us, and all of our guests today who have been phenomenal.
Well, and you raised an excellent point, and something I want to talk about to the liberty movement specifically right now is that it is easy for us to become dismayed at things that have happened. We look at the world, and sometimes we see the growth of government. We see expansion of the powers of people to impact our liberty. And even though we can despair at that, even though we can feel like we're not making progress, we only have to look at the civil rights movement. And at least for me, when I feel depressed, I look at what they went through and I feel shamed that I bothered to think about being depressed, because they showed perseverance, keep going, find a way, different tacks. You have Martin Luther King, you have Malcolm X, you have all the different movements that eventually came to where we are now. And the civil rights isn't done, but we're getting better. And liberty movement is the same way. We're in a situation right now where people can find another way to exercise their liberty muscles. And, there are other ways, right?
Well, and so timely that this is also Pride Month. We are talking about, attacks on individual and civil liberties across the board. That's including within our own movement.
Yeah. And so when we say, all these different liberty movements, it's important to talk about I think, who we are and why we put this broadcast on, because People for Liberty is an organization that's dedicated to the idea that freedom is the birthright of humanity. It's not something that's given to you by government. We're all meant to be free. And, you know, if you say government, you have to say politics, because the two are intertwined. And we're not a political organization. We're a freedom organization. We're a human organization. And those are the things that we really want to reach out to people. And talking about this, in Juneteenth, it's not a political holiday. It's not something that the government just gave to everybody. It's a human holiday, and us acknowledging the human aspects of what slavery was and what freedom means, and getting us there. And it's one of the reasons that I am so grateful to you, Lauren, for asking me to come in and be a part of People for Liberty. You know, my chance to serve here is very meaningful to me.
I feel very privileged, Dan, for you and Holly and Larry and Joe and all of the individuals who have seen value in what we are doing and what we hope to accomplish. I'm so excited that we're now taking more moves to bring liberty into action. And Holly, I know that's what you're passionate about as well. So how can we get people excited and amped up and move these emotions forward to affect change at the local, state, and national level?
Well, I think there's so many different ways that we can get liberty in action. The first that I can think of, if you want to be involved and act with us, is volunteer with us. So peopleforliberty.org, volunteer, reach out. We've had so many people reach out and volunteer already, and it's crucial. I think we've all heard about thoughts and prayers, and I love seeing actions. So the first one I would say is volunteer. And the second way is to stay abreast with what we're doing and join our newsletter. So joining our newsletter, you can follow along with what we have next and what's coming up, who our next speakers are going to be, when our next Liberty lunches are. And then the third is really, I'd encourage anyone to get involved with any Liberty organization, anybody that's focused on liberty, anyone that's focused on freedom. And I know for us, we're meeting people where they are in liberty. And that's my favorite part. We're meeting people where they know about liberty, having a conversation about liberty with individual single issue cases, and then bringing that into an active liberty community. We can also do it through our group. There's so many ways, Lauren. There's so many ways to be active. And anyone that hears me for 30 seconds is, well, what are you doing about it? How do we get out there? What are we going to do? And I could talk about that forever, but I would say volunteer with us in our newsletter.
I love that, Holly, and I appreciate you putting that call for more volunteers, knowing that we have a lot coming up, y'all. Opportunities for action, our Liberty at the Border events, it will be next. But we're looking to take these online live streaming events, bring them to you live, empower you with the tools that you need to have tough conversations about liberty with the people in your community, your loved ones. I'm here talking to my parents. Juneteenth is a day for important conversations. So Dan, Holly, we have an exciting time ahead for us. So those in the liberty movement that are looking for a home, a welcoming, diverse, and inclusive home, we hope you'll consider us.
Yeah, I would like to extend the invitation to all my liberty friends to join me here at People for Liberty, and let's do something.
Exactly. Great sign off, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you guys soon.